Chapter 716. In these 2 years, that rumor had always existed, but no one believed it, so it was gradually forgotten, because it made no sense. No matter how talented Qin Chongqing was in the path of the sword, he still had to be reasonable. Today, they finally saw that legendary scene and realized that the rumor was actually true. It truly made no sense. First, one had to have so many swords. Second, one had to have a sufficiently powerful spiritual sense, so powerful that it surpassed imagination, so stable that it was unimaginable. Only then could one control so many swords. Moreover, it could not be simple control. If one could only use one's spiritual sense to control these swords to slash and stab, one would be unable to make more complex transformations or respond in a timely manner. To star condensation experts like them, it was meaningless. They could completely disregard it. Yes, one had to have so many swords, and one's spiritual sense was so powerful that it could be grasped like a hand. But one also had to know so many sword styles. These requirements were too high. Logically speaking, no one under the starry sky could accomplish them. However, these conditions seemed to be tailor-made for Qin Chongqing. He had so many swords, he could control so many swords. Or perhaps these swords were willing to listen to his will, and then he knew so many sword styles. Thus, Qin Chongqing could accomplish this seemingly illogical thing. As a result, to the experts of the imperial court, today's battle had become an illogical thing. Qin Chongqing only needed to simultaneously control these swords in the air to attack, and it would be equivalent to several dozen or even several hundred Qin Chongqings attacking. How could they fight this? Snowflakes drifted down from the sky, falling on Qin Chongqing's shoulders and painting him with a thin layer of white. At the same time, these snowflakes also fell on the several hundred swords around him, adding many white lines to the world. He walked forward, and the several hundred swords in the air moved forward with him, noiselessly. This scene was abnormally bizarre, causing one's heart to palpitate with fear. The several hundred swords faintly vibrated in the wind and snow, making no sound. Only when an external force disturbed them would they hum. Several sword glows abruptly illuminated a corner of the wind and snow. The crisp hum of swords and the dull clashing of swords resounded at almost the same time. A stream of blood flew out and fell onto the snowy ground. A broken sword stabbed into the wall at an angle, so deep that its shadow could not be seen. The sword glows suddenly faded, and then everything returned to silence. The 2 experts of the imperial court who attempted to launch a sneak attack were unable to pass through the sword net formed by the several hundred swords. One was injured while the other retreated. A few traces remained in the wind and snow. One could faintly make out the general appearance of the second move of the true sword of the orthodoxy and the gathering evening clouds of the 3 forms of Wenshui. Qin Chongqing walked through the dilapidated courtyard, and the hundreds of swords in the air followed him, passing through the walls of the courtyard, like fishes passing through rocks in a stream. There was a large water tank in the courtyard over there. There was a thin layer of ice floating on the surface of the tank. Qin Chongqing glanced in that direction. Hundreds of swords followed his gaze and aimed at the water jar. Crack, crack, crack. Countless cracking sounds rang out at the same time. The thin layer of ice on the surface of the water jar was cut into countless pieces. At the same time, the water jar itself was also cut into countless pieces. Amidst the splashing sounds, water poured out of the vat, stirring up the snow on the ground. At the same time, an assassin covered in blood fell to the ground along with the water. The assassin's body was riddled with sword wounds and was constantly bleeding, but he didn't seem to feel any pain and only looked at Qin Chongqing in shock. "Retreat further!" an official of the department for purging officials yelled. They were all star condensation experts with rich combat experience. They quickly reacted. As long as they maintained a sufficient distance, the threat of these swords would be greatly reduced. There were even some people who had calculated a safe distance, which was around 8 zhang. Instantly, there was the sound of rushing wind. Several dozen experts appeared and scattered around the courtyard. They were at least 10 zhang away from Qin Changsheng, but they did not leave. Seeing this, Qin Changsheng's steps did not pause. He continued forward, quickly returning to the courtyard in the alley of the Northern Military Department. The crabapple tree in the courtyard no longer had a single leaf. Its bare branches stretched out in the snowy sky and did not take up much space. But when the several hundred swords arrived in the courtyard, the space seemed rather cramped. Broken branches were not fallen leaves. When they fell from the sky, they would not rustle. That crabapple tree that had been moved here from the mountains on the outskirts of the capital no more than a few weeks ago had noiselessly disintegrated into countless splinters of wood, becoming a pile on the snowy ground. This scene was still very strange. The courtyard was filled with swords, swift and fierce to the extreme. The world was filled with sword intents, incomparably awe-inspiring. Anyone who wanted to break through these swords and attack Qin Changsheng would have to face the all-out attack of these awe-inspiring sword intents. On the snowy street, Wang Pa and he had split up. Wang Pa had gone to fight Taishu because he was skilled at defeating the strong from a position of weakness. Reality had proven that he had truly succeeded. Qin Changsheng had come to this courtyard to kill Zhou Tong because he was skilled at fighting one against many. This was the same principle. He's finally using his strongest move. Xiao De stood at the stone gate of the courtyard and looked at Qin Changsheng. At this moment, Qin Changsheng was standing on the stone steps. The distance between the two was neither too far nor too close, neither too much nor too little, precisely 8 zhang. This distance explained many things. Firstly, Xiao De did not have the confidence to simultaneously face the collective attack of several hundred swords. Secondly, he seemed to have a deep understanding of Qin Changsheng's moves. Just like what he said, a few days ago, Eunuch Lin had been heavily injured in the Orthodox Academy, shocking many people who knew the inside story. Qin Changsheng's moves had long ago been no secret to people at Xiao De's level. Within the same level, you truly can be said to be invincible. Xiao De continued to speak, somewhat sorrowful. Invincible within the same level sounded very normal, but this was not the case. In the last 1,000 years, no one had been able to do this. Before breaking through, Wang Po's strength had been roughly on par with Xue Xingchuan's. When Su Li was at the initial level of star condensation, he had been beaten like a dog by a girl from the snowy plains of the north. Even Zhou Dufu hailed as the strongest expert under the starry sky. Everyone knew that when he was at the upper level of ethereal opening, he was assuredly not a match for the precocious Qin Xuanba, even if Chen Xuanba had also been at the upper level of ethereal opening. The current Qin Changsheng could truly be invincible within the same level. He was at the initial level of star condensation, and there were faint signs of another breakthrough. But let alone the initial level of star condensation, not even the middle level of star condensation could find a single person that could defeat him. Not a single one. It was impossible, because the number of swords he had was the number of him. To fight with him was to fight with countless of him. Who could defeat him? Fortunately, it's only invincible within the same level. Shout aside. Otherwise, I really would have to turn and leave. Chapter 717. Yesterday, I wrote the wrong sentence about Su Li. First, I apologize, and then I thank my friend who likes to make trouble with flying saucers for reminding me. Regarding bugs, there will definitely be a lot of articles in the coming days. After Mother fell ill, the entire family spends the vast majority of their time in the hospital. I truly do not have enough time and energy to devote to work, so I will often stop updating and the quality will definitely not be stable. I ask for everyone's understanding and kindly remind me to testify. In the future, I will properly revise. Today, before I went to the hospital, the leader said to give Mother some nuts to eat. I smugly ran over to the tea table and bent down, and then, oh no, the protrusion of my lumbar disc came back. After a year, I thought back to last year's meeting with my book friends in Guangzhou. It felt very familiar. It was still that smell, It was still that inconvenient to move. It was still that pain, the pain of cursing. "So, this is useless to me," Xiao very seriously said to Qin Chongsheng. No matter how much hot water was added to the wooden tub, it was impossible to make the water boil. Even if you piled earth into a mountain taller than the mausoleum of books, it would still be impossible for it to be harder than stone. Even if Qin Chongsheng really could turn himself into 10,000, he still could not rely on quantity to break through to a higher level. This principle was not difficult to understand. Cultivating the Tao was the cruelest thing in the world. It was never believed that hard work could make up for one's lack of talent, that quantitative change could never lead to qualitative change. Right now, he could simultaneously face many initial or even middle-level star condensation experts, but it was very difficult to kill them all. More importantly, when he was facing peak star condensation experts like Xiao De and Xiao Zhang, the gap in cultivation levels between them would rapidly reduce his advantage in numbers. Back in the Garden of Zhou, he had been able to directly confront the golden-winged Great Peng controlled by Nank, not because he was powerful, but because the 10,000 famed swords that had awakened in the sword pool had transformed the yearning they had accumulated over the centuries into battle intent. Only then could he display that world-shaking ultimate strike. Now that the Garden of Zhou was quiet and the famed swords had returned to their respective mountains, the swords that remained by his side, nourished in the vault sheath and gradually becoming new, were no longer capable of condensing that sort of battle intent. In other words, the mystical sight of 10,000 swords forming a dragon could no longer be reproduced in this world. Of course, you're still very frightening, with sorrow for the present and fear for the future, Xiao De said. If you survive and cultivate to the peak of star condensation, just what sort of situation will you and your swords create? If it really was as Xiao De said, then the future Qin Chongsheng would be able to fight against 10,000 cavalry, able to besiege cities and destroy countries. At that time, people like us will not be able to resist at all in front of you. We will be beaten like dogs by you. Xiao De paused, then looked at Qin Chongsheng and continued, "And this is unfair to us." The courtyard was deathly still. The broken crabapple tree had died a long time ago, and even the wind was silent between the floating swords, not daring to move. When the experts of the imperial court heard Xiao De's words, they fell silent, complex emotions on their faces. Qin Chongsheng didn't say anything. His thin lips were slightly pressed together, forming a line, just like the line formed by the hundreds of swords in the snowy sky. No martial cultivator was willing to see such a future. They were willing to become a dog under the sword of a peerless genius. Moreover, they were enemies to begin with. In order to prevent such a terrifying future from appearing, the only thing they could do, the only thing they had to do, was kill the current Qin Chongsheng. Xiao De continued to calmly stare at Qin Chongsheng. Suddenly, a tawny light surged out of his eyes and a terrifying qi emerged. This qi was brimming with a primitive and barbaric aura. Even the tiniest fragment seemed to be dripping with the freshest beast blood. His clothes were stretched taut, revealing his inner body that was as sturdy as a mountain, and then they were pierced through by countless beast hairs that were as hard as steel needles. His chest originally had an extremely deep wound. It was caused by Qin Chongsheng's blazing sword when they first fought. It had been slowly bleeding, but at this moment the bleeding suddenly stopped. The wound healed at a speed visible to the naked eye, and then it could no longer be seen. Qin Chongsheng tightened his grip on his sword. He knew that his opponent was about to use his strongest move. The demi-human race possessed many advantages that humans found difficult to compare to, such as speed, strength, and the natural toughness of their bodies. But their greatest advantage was that demi-human experts could temporarily reveal their true bodies, borrowing from the ancestral bloodline hidden in their fate wheels to increase their speed and strength, allowing their bodies to become even more resilient. This was the berserk transformation. There was a hum in the courtyard. The crabapple branches, scattered on the ground, were blown up by the wind and smashed against the wall, where they became even finer. Xiao De disappeared from the stone gate and appeared in front of Chen Chongqing. The several hundred swords in the snowy sky trembled, then suddenly fell silent. In a flash, Xiao had crossed the distance of 8 zhang and been struck by the 6 swords. But these 6 swords that had successively displayed exquisite sword techniques could not slow his steps in the slightest. 6 sword slashes appeared on his body, blood seeping out of them. As the supreme expert of the senior generation of the demi-human race, his body was terrifyingly tough, and after the berserk transformation, it had reached an inconceivable level. If not for the fact that Chen Chongqing's swords had all come from the sword pool, famed swords from several hundred years ago, he might not even have been able to leave a few sword slashes on Xiao De's body. In the wind and snow, Xiao De's fist smashed down at Chen Chongqing. Just like at the very beginning, when they had first met outside the wall, he still did not use a weapon. After returning from Mount Han, Xiao De's temperament had become much steadier, and his cultivation had also improved. The greatest change was that he had become even more confident in his fists. He had a weapon, but on the mountain path of Mount Han, before he had time to pull it out, Lu Qing had stabbed him with the sword, and then in the persimmon forest by the stream, he had encountered the demon lord. Whether he took out his weapon or not, it was still a joke. From that point on, Xiao De abandoned his weapon and only used his hands. Compared to swords, sabers, spears, and magical artifacts, only the hands were the true weapons of cultivators. Attacking was faster than drawing the sword. It was also faster than Chen Chongqing's sword. Before Chen Chongqing could strike, Xiao De's fist had arrived. Fortunately, he had been holding the yellow paper umbrella in his left hand. The umbrella borrowed the wind to rise and block Xiao De's fist. The umbrella's surface caved in, a massive force surging through it. With a boom, Chen Chongqing's left foot, which had been left behind, sank deep into the ground. The hard stone floor was crushed into a spiderweb by his foot, the center sinking deep like a whirlpool. Several cracking sounds came from his body. He didn't know which part of his bones had cracked or even broken. A sword glow that was so sharp that it seemed rather mournful lit up at the edge of the yellow paper umbrella. Xiao De bellowed and raised his fist to strike again. For a moment, a fierce gust of wind swept through the courtyard. The crabapple branches in the courtyard all disappeared. Countless cracks appeared on the walls, and chunks of lime incessantly peeled off. It seemed like tens of thousands of years had passed in this brief moment. As the fist descended like a mountain, the experts of the imperial court collectively attacked Chen Chongqing. Sword intents crisscrossed the courtyard, countless sword techniques emerging one after another. After an unknown period of time, the place became quiet again. Xiao De borrowed the force of the recoil to sweep back to the stone gate of the courtyard like a sandstorm, seemingly completely unharmed. Suddenly, a soft scratching sound rang out on his face. With this sound, a sword wound grew to about half an inch across his face. Blood flowed out, so deep that bone could be seen. It was abnormally terrifying. Chen Chongqing stood in front of the stone steps and sheathed his sword. Several hard beast hairs fell from the sky and smashed on the ground like steel needles, emitting a crisp sound. With this sound, Chen Chongqing began to cough, coughing incessantly. His face grew paler and paler, his feet trembling in the rubble and his body tottering. It was obvious that his injuries were even worse than Xiao De's. Xiao De's expression was very grave, but it was not because he had been injured by Chen Chongqing again. No matter how tough his body was, it was impossible for him to resist the stainless sword on the tier of legendary weapons. It was because there was not a single sword wound on Chen Chongqing's body. This meant that in the chaotic battle just now, none of the swords of the several dozen experts of the imperial court had been able to get close to him. In the face of his full-strength attack, Chen Chongqing had clearly suffered significant injuries. So how could he still control the several hundred swords in the courtyard? Xiao De was very confused. It must be known that although the strength of Chen Chongqing's spiritual sense far surpassed that of ordinary cultivators, it was not too exaggerated for an expert like him. Just how had Chen Chongqing done it? Xiao silently gazed at the several hundred swords in the snowy sky. He did not understand this matter, but he could at least confirm that for Chen Chongqing to simultaneously control these several hundred swords, it was assuredly consuming his spiritual sense at an extremely rapid rate. If this battle continued, it was highly likely that Chen Chongqing would not fall, but his spiritual sense would already be exhausted. How much longer can you last? Xiao drew back his gaze and looked at Chen Chongqing. If you insist on staying here, the final outcome will be to be punched to death by me one punch at a time. Several hundred swords calmly floated in the snowy sky, guarding Chen Chongqing's surroundings. This could be viewed as a defensive sword array or as an offensive vanguard, but it was also like a prison cell. It was very difficult for others to break into this prison cell, and it was also very difficult for Chen Chongqing to walk out because he did not dare to open the door. So how much longer could he last? I don't know. Chen Chongqing thought for a while, then said, "At least until Zhou Tong dies." Upon hearing this, Xiao finally understood and was somewhat shocked. In truth, Chen Chongqing had already expressed his stance before, but he and the surrounding experts of the imperial court had not believed him. But now Xiao was more and more convinced of his words, because even now, Chen Chongqing still had not left, still standing in front of the stone steps. Chen Chongqing was here, so he and all the experts of the imperial court could only remain here. The great Zhou imperial court's arrangements today had originally been to kill Wang Pei and Chen Chongqing. But after fighting for so long, Xiao had already given up on this idea. He knew that Chen Chongqing still had tricks up his sleeve. Just these swords floating in the snowy sky were simply not enough to defeat Eunuch Lin in the Orthodox Academy. If Chen Chongqing used those tricks, he could at least break out of the encirclement. Why did he not leave? Could it be that he really was stalling for time, waiting for Zhou Tong to be killed by someone else? Chen Chongqing said nothing more because he had already given his answer, and twice. At the very beginning of today, it had been him and Wang Pei who wanted to kill Zhou Tong. Later on, the imperial court used this matter to kill him and Wang Pei. The situation was constantly changing, constantly swinging back and forth. That person had still not appeared. He had probably been left behind in the imperial palace by his senior brother. The Li Palace had been quiet this entire time, presumably temporarily suppressed by that saint. But that saint naturally could not do anything else. The most crucial change in the entire situation was that Tai Shu had not been able to kill Wang Pei, but had been killed by Wang Pei. Thus, they traced the source. The situation had returned to its original starting point. It was still killing Zhou Tong. So he would hold on here, hold on until Zhou Tong died. He believed that Zhou Tong would assuredly die. No matter who killed him, he would die. Chapter 718. For many reasons, Chen Chongqing had to kill Zhou Tong. One of the most important reasons was that the coup of the Mausoleum of Books had begun with his killing of Zhou Tong. When he had walked into this courtyard, it had been the beginning of the change in history, the source of all life and death. Now the Tianhai Divine Empress was dead, many people were dead, and the river of history had taken a great turn. Yet Zhou Tong was still alive and well, perhaps even living better than before. No matter how he thought about it, he felt that he should finish this matter. Even now, he still did not know where Zhou Tong was. At this moment, Xiao and he simultaneously lowered their heads to look at the snow on the ground of the courtyard. The snow was currently moving extremely faintly, as if an extremely weak tremor was coming from the depths of the earth. Several officials of the Department for Purging Officials glanced at each other, their faces filled with shock and doubt. Their eyes quickly became determined as they tightly gripped their swords and looked at Chen Chongqing. Chen Chongqing did not look at them, only stared at the snow on the ground. Suddenly, 10 sword glows illuminated the courtyard and slashed at the ground. The snow madly danced, and the sword intents were swift and fierce. The gray stone floor was instantly shattered, and black dirt flew into the air. In just a few moments, a hole half a foot deep had been dug into the ground of the courtyard. The officials of the Department for Purging Officials bellowed in shock and fury, one after another using their most powerful sword techniques in an attempt to force Qin Changxing to stop his actions. Xiao De vaguely guessed at something, and a vicious light exploded in his eyes. His two fists were like mountains as they smashed at the several hundred swords in the air. There had once been a crabapple tree in this courtyard, but it had been destroyed by Qin Changxing. Later on, a new crabapple tree had been moved in, almost exactly the same as the original. Even the cold-blooded and emotionless officials of the Department for Purging Officials, who had no interest in beautiful things, found this rather strange. Of course, this crabapple tree had also been destroyed, similarly by Qin Changxing. In order to find this exact same crabapple tree, the Yamen of the Department for Purging Officials had expended a great deal of effort. After waiting for some time, the pit dug in the ground near the courtyard wall had been empty for a very long time. On a certain autumn night, it had even transformed into a small pond. However, before dawn, the water had sunk into the earth and vanished without a trace. The office of the Department for Purging Officials was located in the alley of the Northern Military Department, which was also known as Zhou Prison. However, very few people knew that the true Zhou Prison was actually 70 zhang below the tree pit in the gloomy underground. It was formed from 5 prison cells, its walls made of stone surrounded by compacted earth and countless jagged fragments of stone. It was also protected by countless arrays. This place was deep underground, and there were layers upon layers of formations concealing it. It was extremely secretive, and no outsiders had ever entered before. This place was very sturdy. Whether it was Qin Changxing's first charge into Zhou Prison, the 10,000 swords like a rainbow, the fierce blade intent, or the sword intents crisscrossing the ground, none of them had any effect on this place, not even the slightest ripple. In the deepest prison cell, the dim light was very stable, shining on the small table in the room. On the table were a plate of peanuts, 2 pots of wine, and 2 pairs of chopsticks. The middle-aged man sitting on the east side had a tall and sturdy figure. Although his prison uniform was covered in blackened bloodstains, his hair was disheveled, and he had a missing arm. It was still impossible to conceal his heroic and valiant aura. It was precisely the divine General Shui, he who had been brought back to the capital a few days ago. The middle-aged man sitting across from him was not wearing official robes, but an ordinary cloth gown. His figure was thin, his cheeks sunken, his face pale, and his eyes deep and serene. He looked just like a ghost. Many people had died in Zhou Prison, but it was unknown if there were any ghosts. Even if there really were, they had probably been tortured beyond words by this person and had long since reincarnated. He was the master of Zhou Prison. In this place, even ghosts feared him. That breathtaking sword strike from before had only pierced through his red official's robe. From that moment on, everyone, whether it was Qin Changxing or anyone else, was guessing where he was hiding. Many people believed that he was hiding in the imperial palace, while others even believed that he had been scared out of his wits and fled the capital. No one expected that he would still remain here, remaining in this courtyard, just that he was deep underground. To put it another way, there had always been a distance of 17 zhang between him and Qin Changxing. He cared nothing about this, calmly eating peanuts and drinking wine. It seemed like no matter how fierce the rain of swords on the ground was, it had nothing to do with him. "You're afraid," Shui he said as he looked into his eyes. He was a very famous divine general of the Great Zhou because he was Shui Xingquan's younger brother. But this did not mean that he was incapable. On the battlefield of the north, he had led the soldiers against the wolf cavalry of the demon race in a war that had lasted for decades. He had a very deep understanding of life and death and fear. When people were at their most fearful, they would often insist on staying in the place they were most familiar with, even if this choice was not the wisest. Zhou Tong had not gone to the imperial palace, but had stayed here. Afterwards, some people might sigh in admiration at his composure and intelligence, but in Shui's view, this could only mean that he was afraid. The Zhou prison, deep underground, was the place Zhou Tong was most familiar with. In this place he had killed far too many people, demons, tortured far too many people, demons. Zhou Tong did not go to the imperial palace because of the warning in the depths of his heart and his distrust of that saint. However, he would not explain this to Shui. He was his prisoner and did not have the right for him to explain. Moreover, he did not want anyone to know that his loyalty to that saint was not as firm as others imagined. The prison cells deep underground were too damp and dark. It was impossible for people to feel comfortable, even for Zhou Tong himself. The cell Shui he was in was relatively the driest one. Only after a very long time would a single drop of water fall from the stone wall above, and it would not land on the table or the bed covered with straw. This was naturally preferential treatment, even though the golden thorns on Shui's body that were used to restrict his cultivation had been personally pierced by Zhou Tong. "Don't try to anger me," Zhou Tong calmly said. "I won't kill you. After all, he said that we are also brothers." Zhou Tong and Shui Xingchuan were brothers, and Shui Xingchuan and Shui he were also brothers. Only the three brothers and Madame Shui knew of this matter. In the past few years, Shui Xingchuan had always hoped that he and Zhou Tong could also become true brothers. He did not like Zhou Tong, but he had never expressed it. When he learned that his big brother had been personally poisoned to death by Zhou Tong, he was filled with extreme grief and indignation, but he remained calm. This was because he had never treated Zhou Tong as his brother, and he also knew that Zhou Tong was this sort of person. Upon hearing these words, he finally lost control of his emotions and spat out a mouthful of phlegm, tinged with blood. Zhou Tong turned to dodge, but he did not turn back. He maintained this posture, gazing at a stone wall in the southwest corner of the prison cell. He could sense that deep within that stone wall, there was a very light but distinct vibration. Someone had touched the array. Chapter 719. Zhou Tong stared at the stone wall, his eyes growing deeper and more sinister, like two balls of will-o'-the-wisps. This weak vibration seemed very ordinary, but to this underground world that was protected and stabilized by layers upon layers of arrays, it signified something very frightening. Someone had touched Zhou Prison's array, and it was not like an insect throwing itself into a spider's web. It was like a zither player stretching out his finger, pulling on a string and lightly plucking it. Zhou Tong stared at the stone wall. He did not notice that a drop of water had fallen from a crack in the ceiling of the prison cell. The underground was very humid. Even with the isolation of the array, the surrounding walls still had many places where water was seeping through. Even in this relatively dry prison cell, this scene did not seem too out of place. The problem was that this drop of water had fallen in a very coincidental position, right on the mouth of the wine pot. The moisture in the earth had been filtered through the layers of rocks and arrays. By the time it seeped out of the stone wall, it was completely devoid of impurities, as clean as a dewdrop. The dewdrop noiselessly slid down the slender porcelain spout and into the wine pot. At this moment, Zhou Tong turned around. "Shui," he said, "Qin Changxing should have sensed it. He should have guessed that you were here." Zhou Tong knew, so he was in a hurry to leave. He did not know who had touched the array, but he had actually managed to enter Zhou prison. That person should still be some distance away, but he had still unhesitatingly decided to leave. Just as he had said, that person had very likely used this method to inform the people above of his specific location. He calmly said, "There have always been many people who wanted me dead. I'm the same." He raised the wine pot in front of him and filled his empty cup. Zhou Tong raised the wine pot and also filled his cup. He raised his cup and said, "I hope that you die very slowly." Death was a very frightening matter, but if the process was fast enough, it could be called delightful. If it was very slow, then only pain would be left. Zhou Tong smiled, lightly clinked his cup with shui, and then brought it to his lips and drank. No matter how fast Qin Changxing's sword is, it's impossible for him to get here so quickly. Zhou Tong's gaze once more turned to the stone wall that had quieted down. This was the most secretive and safest hiding place he had arranged for himself. Yet he chose to abandon it without the slightest hesitation and find another place to hide. No matter how much Shui hated this person, he had to admit that this kind of decisiveness was truly powerful to the extreme. At the same time, he was a bit curious and asked, "Although I don't know how heavy the snowstorm is today, I can imagine that there aren't many places in the capital that can guarantee your safety. Where can you go? Even a rabbit will leave 3 holes for escape, let alone humans like us." Zhou Tong said, "You'll definitely feel regretful. It's really not easy for an evil person like me to die. At least I won't die today." After saying this, he didn't say anything else. He walked out of the prison cell and followed the dim alley, heading towards an even darker place. The lights on both sides of the alley were similar to the dim light in his eyes. They were both ghostly fires. His figure gradually disappeared at the end of the alley, as if he was walking towards hell, until he sank into the deepest darkness. Separated by the iron bars, he silently gazed at Zhou Tong's back for a very long time. Even after Zhou Tong had disappeared, he was still gazing. It was not because he was sorrowful, nor was it because he truly did have some complex emotions in his heart. He just wanted to confirm that Zhou Tong had truly left. Water droplets once more fell from the stone ceiling, and then they scraped against the side walls. 2 hard stones were moved aside, and a ball of mud was squeezed out. This was not true mud, but a person that had lived in the mud for several weeks. On the night of the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, Qin Changxing had been brought to the Mausoleum of Books by the Divine Empress. Tang Tang had been brought back to Winshui by the Tang Second Master, and then Jishio had vanished. No one had ever discovered any trace of him again, not the imperial court, the Li Palace, or the Orthodox Academy. It turned out that he had been hiding in the alley of the Northern Military Department the entire time, just deep underground. If explained in detail, it would be very long and complicated, but it was actually very simple. The Department for Purging officials had replanted crabapple trees and dug a hole in the courtyard. He had jumped into this hole and remained underground until now. No one knew how he had managed to survive these several weeks. But to Jishio, this was a very normal matter. He was a wolf, possessing unimaginable patience and willpower. In order to catch prey, he could wait for a very long time, could endure hunger and thirst that humans could not. In order to kill the demon cavalry, he would often hide in the depths of the snow, hiding for several weeks at a time. Although snow was much softer than mud, it was also much colder. Zhou Tong was the strongest in his hunting experience, and he was also the prey that he most wanted to kill. Thus, he had expended even more patience, but of course, he had also paid no small price. His face was very pale and extremely gaunt. Although his eyes were still cold and focused, they were clearly much weaker than they were on the surface. He looked at him and asked, "Were you the one who activated the array?" "No, I don't understand arrays, nor did I know that Qin Changxing would come." Jishio's voice was very hoarse because he had drunk very little water in the last several weeks, and also because he had spoken very little. He thought back to the day when he had just been imprisoned in this deepest prison cell. The voice that came from the stone wall was very low and very hoarse. At the time, he did not know who was in the stone wall, whether it was a human or a ghost. But after hearing what it had to say, even if it really was a ghost, he would still cooperate with it. He extended his hand and pulled out the golden thorns from his blood-stained clothes. His brow creased, and he let out a painful grunt. 10 golden thorns had been pulled out, but only 1/3 of their true length. This was something that he and Jishio had prepared ahead of time. In the original plan, he wanted to cooperate with Jishio and think of a way to poison Zhou Tong. Then, he would do his best to delay until Zhou Tong was poisoned, Jishio would break through the wall and join forces with him. At the start, reality had gone much more smoothly than imagined. The poisoning had been smoothly completed. But unexpectedly, someone had activated the array and frightened Zhou Tong away. It was very obvious that the person hiding in the shadows did not know of Jeshio's existence. And of course, he did not know of Jeshio's plan. But he still wanted Zhou Tong to die. Shui, he said, go notify Qin Changshen. I'll go chase after Zhou Tong. Jeshio did not object, but this did not mean that he tacitly agreed. It only meant that he would not listen to Shui's words. He gave a bunch of keys to Shui, walked out of the prison cell, and headed in the direction that Zhou Tong had disappeared. At the very beginning, he walked very slowly, because he was weak and also because he had been crawling through the mud for the past several dozen days. It had been a very long time since he had relied on his 2 feet to walk. It did not take long for his movements to become coordinated. Although they were still not very fast, they were stable enough. Zhou Tong walked through the gloomy alleyways. Every once in a while he would make a turn, and from time to time a door would fall down and then be covered up by the mud. The underground alleyways had always been as dense as a spider's web, and with this method it had become incomparably complicated. He believed that even if someone helped Qin Changsheng break through the imperial court's encirclement and Qin Changsheng found the true location of Zhou prison and killed his way underground, he would still not be able to find him. This thought made him feel much more at ease, and he rubbed his chest. His brow creased because he realized that his heart was beating rather fast. He didn't know if it was because he was walking too quickly or if it was for some other reason. Like fear, he was not willing to admit that he was afraid. He took a deep breath and began to circulate his true essence, preparing to calm his heartbeat. The true essence in his meridians flowed smoothly, just like water flowing in a canal suddenly meeting a bank that could not be crossed. His chest felt a sharp pain. He began to vomit blood. This blood was black. This is the 2nd season of Week of Killing. When I wrote about the 1st season of Week of Killing, everyone knew from the chapter title that Zhou Tong would not have died at that time. I would have been extremely serious in killing him. Today is Christmas Eve, so I wish everyone a good time. However, I still have to say the most important thing. Just like last year, ladies, please pay attention to safety measures. Chapter 720. Zhou Tong stopped, his eyes narrowing. In the gloomy light of the lantern, he could still clearly see the color of the blood, as that blood was so black that it was somewhat dazzling. He could feel the heart beneath his palm beating faster and faster, causing his hand and arm to tremble. His shoulders also began to tremble, and then his entire body. His face became abnormally pale, as if he had suffered a serious illness in such a short amount of time. He had been poisoned, and it was a rare and powerful poison. The reason he had so quickly determined that this poison was very rare was because his department for purging officials was the place in the world most skilled at using poisons. He had personally seen and personally used more poisons than an ordinary person could eat in their entire lives. When had he been poisoned? He didn't know. A faint light flashed past his squinted eyes at high speed. Although there were no clues, he quickly determined who had poisoned him and when he had been poisoned. This didn't require any evidence. All he needed to do was to go back in time and have a grasp of some details. His assailant was probably still in his original position, but he did not turn around because the first thing he needed to consider was how to leave. He took a handkerchief from his sleeve and wiped the filthy blood from the corner of his mouth. He continued forward, quickly vanishing into the darkness. After some time, a faint sound came from the darkness. The faint light of the lantern on the stone wall came back to life, reflecting Jeshio's pale face, his face stained with the traces of dried mud. He squatted down, dipped his hand in some of the filthy blood, and brought it to his nose to sniff. The black, dirty blood on the sharp, cold, knife-like fingers gave off a faint stench of blood. He was very satisfied. Following the scent, he quickly vanished into the darkness. The tunnels beneath the office of the Department for Purging Officials were as numerous and complex as a spider's web. Moreover, they were unimaginably long and could lead directly to very distant places. If it were possible, if it were any other time, Zhou Tong would normally stay underground for even longer, take even more detours, and set up even more mechanisms to ensure his absolute safety. But not today. He had already been poisoned. This poison was completely different from the poisons commonly used by the Department for Purging Officials. It did not specifically target his meridians, star orifices, or sea of consciousness. Instead, it was like a handful of sand pervading his internal organs, giving off a rough and even rough feeling. It even made him think of the vast plains of the north. This was something that was extremely close to nature, and even the sacred light technique might not be able to cure it. However, he was one of the few people in the world who were best at using poison. In this aspect, his ability could be called a great master. Even if he had never seen this kind of poison before, he knew where to start. To deal with this kind of poison, he could only use medicine, and it had to be herbal medicine. Even in Zhou prison, these herbs were very difficult to find. Fortunately, he knew of a place that was well prepared, and even more fortunate was that this was the place he had originally wanted to go. After walking through the damp, cold, and incomparably long alleyway, he didn't know how many turns he had made. The terrain was no longer flat, but slanted upwards. He continued to walk forward until he reached the end. His hands accurately reached into a gap in the wall, dispelling the formation, and then he turned on the mechanism. His hands pushed forward slightly, pushing open a door and leaving the darkness. A bright ray of sunlight was waiting for him outside the door, as well as a gentle and moving face. The sunlight came from the sky above the courtyard. The gloomy snow clouds had been blown away by the wind, revealing a porcelain blue sky. The warm winter sun appeared in his line of sight. The gentle and moving face belonged to a beautiful young woman. Upon seeing the sunlight and the young woman's face, Zhou Tong instantly felt his body warm up and much calmer. Moreover, the unconcealable worry and anxiety on the young woman's face made his chest heat up. This sort of emotion, completely different from fear and disgust, was what he lacked and needed the most in his life. The young woman helped him out of the tunnel, and then, with some difficulty, she closed the tunnel and reactivated the mechanism. This courtyard was not large, nor could it be said to be exquisite, but whether it was the black eaves or the green bamboo railings, all the details exuded the word tranquility. When Zhou Tong had personally designed this courtyard, he had pursued this sort of thing. He had always believed that only tranquility had the taste of home. This courtyard was his home, his true home. It was the final resting place for his exhausted body and his heart that had been soaked in poison for countless years. Only by returning to this courtyard could he truly find peace, could he truly relax. For the sake of safety, for the sake of keeping this secret, for the sake of this rare peace and freedom from disturbance, Zhou Tong had very cautiously and carefully managed this courtyard. No one knew of this place, not the most loyal subordinates of the Department for Purging Officials, not Qingjun and the other 8 tigers, not even the Divine Empress. The only person who knew of the relationship between him and this courtyard was now dead. Every time he returned to this courtyard and heard the sounds coming from the neighboring courtyard through the green bamboo, Zhou Tong would always remember a few things. In these past few years, Xue Xingchuan had very much hoped that he could treat the Xue estate as his true home. But how could this be possible? Putting aside the fear and unease in the eyes of the servants and juniors of the Xue estate, just the fact that he was surnamed Zhou made it impossible. His elder brother did not want his surname, but he still wanted it. Other than the demon commander, Zhou Tong had probably killed the most people in the world. Perhaps for this reason, he was also most afraid of death. Besides this courtyard, he had several other secret bases in the capital. But to him, none of those places were as safe, as important, or as comfortable as this one. This was because this courtyard had a gentle and moving woman who truly respected and loved him. More importantly, He had hidden many precious objects here, like a few extremely rare herbs. A large portion of these herbs had been secretly obtained by people he had sent from the 100 Herb Garden, while a portion had been gifted to him by the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets. He took the steaming towel and placed it over his face. Perhaps because the heat had irritated his lungs, he let out a few muffled coughs. When he took off the towel, it was already stained with several spots of black blood. It looked like flowers drawn in ink, unreal and rather frightening. The woman was very uneasy, but Zhou Tong seemed especially calm and unperturbed. He had her grind the ink while he sat on a chair, closing his eyes and meditating as if he was savoring something. He was savoring the poison in his body that carried the scent of the wilderness. After some time he opened his eyes. With the woman's support, he walked to the desk in front of the window. Raising a brush, he began to write with great elegance and ease. The paper was dripping with ink, but the handwriting was extremely clear. It was not cursive, but a recipe. What herbs to use, how many bowls of water, how to boil it, what fire to use, what stove, what charcoal, what water, how to filter the medicine. When to add crystals, it was all very clear. The woman saw his expression and knew that he was probably fine. Relieved, she took the recipe and went to the back kitchen to boil the medicine. This sort of thing had happened several times before, and she had experienced it before. There was no mistake in the type or amount of herbs, and the way she lit the stove was very practiced. At some point, a beauty dressed in palace attire had appeared by the stove. The stove fire reddened her face, illuminating her incomparably beautiful face. This beauty was very beautiful. In truth, in the past few years, she had always been considered the most beautiful woman of the great Zhou dynasty. The woman calmly boiled the medicine, her movements of separating the herbs and filtering the dregs very steady. It was like she did not see the beauty. The beauty placed a few things into the pot. The woman still acted like she did not see it. The room was quiet, with only the gurgling of the soup in the pot. Chapter 721. The palace beauty walked to the window and silently gazed at the sunlight in the courtyard. The sunlight fell on her face, but it was unable to bring much warmth. Her beautiful brows and eyes always carried a coldness and haggardness that could not be erased. The kitchen was very quiet, the scene very strange. It slowly persisted and fermented in the sunlight. After some time, the medicine was finished. The woman held the pot with both hands and dipped it into the ice water prepared in the basin, waiting for the medicine to cool. Just like Zhou Tong, the palace beauty was also very skilled in mental techniques. The woman could not see her by the window, most likely because she had been mesmerized by the illusion she had created. Ultimately, the woman raised her head and glanced at her, proving that all this was not an illusion, but reality. The palace beauty leaned against the window and lightly waved her hand, indicating that everything was proceeding as usual. The medicine could not be completely cooled before drinking, as this would more or less lose some of its medicinal strength. The bowl of medicine brought to Zhou Tong was still exuding a thick mist of heat. Zhou Tong was somewhat intoxicated by the heat brought by the mist. This sort of feeling filled him with vigor, but when he completely drank the medicine in the bowl, he was somewhat dissatisfied because the medicine had scalded the roof of his mouth and gums. He did not blame the woman, but he was dissatisfied with his own attitude. He had been a little too hasty. Although he had not been scalded, he still felt somewhat uncomfortable. He used his tongue to lick it. A slightly sweet taste came from the tip of his tongue, somewhat like the taste of rust. He knew that this was the taste of blood and couldn't help but crease his brow. He took a mirror from the table and examined it. He found nothing strange, just that his gums were a little swollen and bleeding. The taste of blood gradually faded, leaving behind only the bitter taste of the medicine. He took 2 sugared peanuts from the plate and threw them into his mouth, carefully chewing them. Ever since he was very young, he had been very afraid of drinking medicine, because medicine was too bitter. Thus, every time he drank medicine, he would prepare a few sweet snacks in advance. As he chewed on the sugared peanuts, he thought about the matter he had encountered today. Shui, he had spent many years leading troops in the snowy plains of the north, so it was only natural that he could obtain this sort of poison. But just now, in the underground prison, how had he poisoned him? Did he want to poison him to avenge Shui Xingchuan and make the world feel that this was the cycle of the heavens and retribution? The problem was that it wasn't that easy to poison himself. A sneer appeared at the corner of Zhou Tong's mouth, and there was an additional hint of pride in his cold eyes. The sugar-coated peanuts were delicious, but the only problem was that they stuck to his teeth. He took out a fine silver toothpick and picked his teeth as he continued to think. There was a high chance that Shui he had already escaped Zhou prison, but that did not matter. Although the world was vast, there was no place for the Shui clan to hide. Zhou Tong's gaze passed through the window and landed on the neighboring courtyard. He thought to himself that after the matter was settled, he would capture Shui he as soon as possible and then poison him to death, slowly poison him to death. He had already thought of which poisons to use to make Shui he die the slowest and most painful death. A slight cracking sound rang in his mouth, interrupting his rambling and pleasurable thoughts at this time. One of his teeth was broken at the root, lying quietly in the palm of his hand. The broken stubble was covered in blood and stains, looking very sinister. Looking at this broken tooth, Zhou Tong's body, which had just warmed up not too long ago, once again turned cold. After a moment of silence, he picked up the mirror and looked at himself again. A single glance was enough to shake one's soul. His gums had already become a purple-black color, and his teeth were extremely loose. It seemed like a light gust of wind would cause them to fall off. The increasingly clear and unbearable pain coming from the broken tooth caused his body to once more tremble. He had only wanted to pick the sugar stains between his teeth, but he had ended up prying out a tooth. The front end of the exquisite silver toothpick had already turned completely black, like charcoal. It was a ghastly sight. All of this was an illusion, he said to himself. He was far too experienced in using poison. He was confident that his judgment was absolutely correct. Even if his method of detoxification could not completely purge the poison in his body, it could definitely temporarily suppress it. Then he would have a lot of time to slowly resolve this problem. But why was it that, even though he had clearly drunk the medicine, the poison in his body had not been suppressed, and instead had become even more terrifying, already gnawing at his teeth? Zhou Tong could not understand and fell silent for a very long time. Even now, he still did not realize that although there was no problem with the medicine he had used, a problem might have occurred in the process of brewing it. He had never doubted the woman. He took out 2 precious pills, put them into his mouth, and swallowed them, temporarily suppressing the poison that was about to erupt. He felt a little dizzy, and his vision a little blurry. If his vision had not been blurry, how could he have seen the woman walk to the gate of the small courtyard? The woman's arm was wrapped in a bundle made of blue floral cloth. The bundle was very small and simple, unable to hold too many things. Yes, of course it was. He had bought so many valuable things for her over the years. So how could such a small bundle possibly be able to hold it all? So she could not be preparing to leave. She could not be preparing to abandon him. It could not be that there was a problem with her. It could not be that she had poisoned him. Then his vision really had been blurry. This poison was truly too powerful, even causing him to hallucinate. Zhou Tong said to himself, then stood up from his chair. There was a distance of about 10 zhang between the room and the main gate, and the courtyard between them was filled with sunlight. He and the woman looked at each other, separated by a patch of sunlight. The woman's expression was calm, gentle, and peaceful. She bowed slightly, just like she always did when she bid farewell to him, but today she was the one bidding farewell. So all of this was not an illusion. Why? Zhou Tong did not ask, because he clearly knew that there were countless reasons for this, but since he had not realized it before, there was no need to realize it now. The cruelest thing in the world was that when you did not want to know the answer, Someone just had to tell you the answer. She does not like you, has never liked you. The palace beauty walked to the gate and said to him, "She is only afraid of you, so she does not dare to leave." Why was she not afraid today? It was naturally because he was about to die. Zhou Tong was not surprised by her appearance. In truth, he was now completely confused. It was not that his medicine was ineffective, but that someone had added another poison to it. From the moment he understood this point, he knew that someone had come to this small courtyard, and he even knew who that person was. The person that understood you the most was naturally not your family, or else Xue Xingchuan would not have died so wretchedly, his corpse almost exposed in the wilderness. The person that understood you the most was also not necessarily your enemy, because you would always be on guard against your enemy, always make many preparations in advance. The person that understood you the most was also not necessarily your friend. Growing old together was very beautiful, but the two of you spent too little time together, the distance between the two cities too great. When you met, you would always drink, reminisce about the past, look forward to the future, bitterly curse your former teacher and the current imperial court. It was very rare for you to have a chance to discuss any of the finer details. Thus, the person that understood you the most was often your work partner. In working day after day for many years, it was very difficult for the two of you to not understand each other. You would drink together many times and talk about many details. Moreover, because of your relationship of hidden and overt competition, the two of you would remember these matters very clearly, preparing to use them at any time in the future. For example, he knew which restaurant you liked to eat the most, you knew which restaurant he liked to eat the most, he knew which leader you hated the most, you knew which channel he liked the most, he knew how many girlfriends you had over the years, you knew how many boats he had stepped on in the past month, and on the morning after Christmas Eve, the two of you might even come out of the same convenience hotel and smile at each other, because it was at this convenience hotel that the company could obtain the most suitable negotiated price. Logically speaking, Zhou Tong did not have any work partners, because the Department for Purging Officials was a very special yamen. It was directly responsible to the Tianhai Divine Empress and did not need to interact with anyone in the imperial court. Qing Jun, the other 8 tigers, and the Redcoat Cavalry were all his subordinates. But there would always be a few rather special existences in the world, like this palace beauty. The Tianhai Divine Empress relied on divine generals like Xue Xingchuan, Tian Chui, and Su Shiji to control the Great Zhou army, but her control over the imperial court and subsequent rule over the millions and millions of people of the Great Zhou was primarily through 2 people. One was Zhou Tong, and the other was naturally Mou. They were the Tianhai Divine Empress's left and right arms in the imperial court, privately denounced by many as villains colluding in evil. They had worked together for many years, and although their minds could not be said to be connected, they had a tacit understanding. Whether facing the Tianhai clan or the powerful will of the military, this tacit understanding had always displayed a very positive effect. Because of this tacit understanding, they had a deep understanding of each other. Zhou Tong knew of the rebellious heart and unwillingness hidden in the depths of Mou's heart, and he even faintly sensed her thoughts about a certain person. Mou knew that he had very well concealed his fear of the Divine Empress and this small courtyard bathed in sunlight, so she had found this place today and then delivered a fatal blow to him. Seeing Mou walk in from the door, Zhou Tong quickly calmed down, even faster than he had expected. In the days after the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, he had always had the Department for Purging Officials investigate, or perhaps confirm, her whereabouts in the south. Perhaps for this reason, he had actually long since mentally prepared himself to see her in the capital. He said to Mou, "I knew that you would definitely return to the capital, but I didn't expect it to be now." Mou asked why. Zhou Tong replied, "Since you know very well that if you return to the capital, you will definitely die." Mou looked at him and said, "I don't really care about this point, as long as you can definitely die before me." Zhou Tong did not know that Chen Chongqing had said something very similar not long ago. He looked at Mou and asked, "You've returned to avenge the Empress?" "I don't have this ability, and you are not my enemy, because you don't have the right." In Mou's view, he was just a dog raised by the Empress. "I've come to punish that dog in the Empress's place." Zhou Tong fell silent, then asked, "How are you prepared to punish this dog?" Mou replied, "Put it in a pot to stew? I think that's pretty good." Zhou Tong looked at her and very seriously said, "You don't have to be that rabbit. It's not that I want to cook the dog when the rabbit is dead. It's just that I'm not as experienced in torturing people as you are, so I can only think of cooking you to death." Mou looked at him and very seriously asked, "Do you have any other good suggestions?" Chapter 7:22. I don't have any suggestions, but I do have a few explanations. Zhou Tong gasped for breath with some difficulty. "These explanations are meaningless to others, but I think that you are different. After all, in these last few years, the two of us were in similar situations. My so-called betrayal stemmed from fear and self-preservation, while you, for the same reason, did many similar things." This was referring to how Mou had hidden from the Divine Empress and listened to the Pope's original intentions, secretly arranging for Chen Chongqing to enter the Orthodox Academy. Mou shook her head. "My fear and self-preservation stemmed from the world after the Empress. It has nothing to do with the Empress. No matter what you say, in my view, since the Empress has never cared about our lives, why must we live for her?" On that night, Chen Chongqing went to the alley of the Northern Military Department to kill me. I almost died, but what did the Empress do? Zhou Tong jeered. She completely ignored my situation, only thinking about how to recognize her son. Alas, she was blind and even recognized the wrong son. As he sneered, his purple-black gums contrasted with his pale face, making for a very unsightly sight. Mou somewhat proudly said, "The Empress cared about me, so she had me and Yuan leave the capital first." Zhou Tong was quiet for a very long time, then suddenly said, "Did you really think that just because I was poisoned you could easily kill me?" Mou did not explain, only stated, "I will kill you. You have the greatest problem. You're too young." Zhou Tong continued, "Being young means that you haven't lived long enough. No matter how high your talent is, your cultivation can't be too high. Moreover, you don't have much patience. You should have appeared a little later, allowing my poison to flare up a little deeper. In addition, you shouldn't have chosen this place. This is my home. Killing someone in their home is always a rather difficult task. To the vast majority of people in the world, home was the place they were most familiar with, the final fortress, the true home field. Zhou Tong had hidden his most cherished tranquility and treasures in this small courtyard, so he had naturally made many corresponding arrangements. There were many mechanisms and arrays in this place. With his words, the sounds of many mechanisms activating could be heard from outside the window. The sunlight in the courtyard seemed to dim as several powerful array intents rose from the ground. The two precious pills had already been converted into essence in his stomach. They flowed through his meridians throughout his body, temporarily suppressing the invasion of the poison and restoring part of his strength. The sun in the sky did not have any real temperature, and the gentle breeze was a little cold. A bloody smell enveloped the entire courtyard along with the array. Without hesitation, he used the secret art of the great crimson gown. If someone used their spiritual sense to observe, they would discover that the entire courtyard had been soaked in a sea of blood. The great crimson gown secret art was his strongest technique, and it consumed an extremely large amount of spiritual sense and true essence. This was especially true now that he had been poisoned by 2 different poisons, so he had no way of maintaining it for too long. However, Mou couldn't stay in this sea of blood. If she didn't want to perish together with him, she had to temporarily retreat. He only needed to take advantage of her temporary retreat to escape from this small courtyard. As long as he reached the street, he would be able to save his own life. This was the most effective method Zhou Tong could think of before he died. The small courtyard looked very ordinary, but there were many important people living on the street outside the courtyard. Back then, he had chosen this place because of this consideration. What happened next surpassed Zhou Tong's imagination. To put it more accurately, it surpassed his understanding of MOU. Because MOU did not leave. She stood by the door, allowing the invisible sea of blood to smear her palace dress with terrifying colors. She was very calm, very focused. The exhaustion on her face had already been completely replaced by a deathly stillness. The palace dress glittered with starlight, shining through the blood. It was a very beautiful sight. A slender sword that seemed very delicate, but contained within it was the wind and rain of time. It pierced through the sea of blood in the room, like a condensed ray of starlight. With a squelch, the delicate sword sank into Zhou Tong's abdomen. The tip of the sword protruded from his waist, bringing with it a stream of black blood. Zhou Tong did not scream, did not howl in pain. He stared in a daze at her in front of him, his face brimming with disbelief. MOU's sword had pierced through his body. His sea of blood had also swallowed MOU's spiritual sense, let alone the fact that MOU was only at the middle level of star condensation. Even if she broke into the peak of star condensation, she would still be unable to leave this sea of blood, this small courtyard. In other words, her death was assured. Why? Zhou Tong quickly understood that she had never thought of living on in the first place. He had wanted to use the words mutual destruction to force her to retreat, but she had originally come to die with him. Her return to the capital had always been a path to death. She only wanted to bring him with her. Whether she fell into the abyss or entered the sea of stars, she wanted to bring him with her, to bring him before the divine empress. Zhou Tong's face became very pale. He did not want to die with her. The entire small courtyard was still under his control, and there were still mechanisms and arrays that had not been activated. He still wanted to gamble. However, he did not succeed, not because of the sword piercing through his body, but because his body had stiffened. A pair of hands fell on his shoulders. These hands were very thin, very withered, like tree branches, very white, as if they had not seen the sun for many days. The nails were very sharp, very long, very sharp, and covered in mud. These were 2 wolf claws. The sharp nails had sunk deeply into Zhou Tong's shoulder bones, piercing several bloody holes from which black blood gurgled. Zhou Tong knew that his injuries were even more severe. Cracks had already appeared on his shoulder bones. His body felt incomparably cold and abnormally terrified. He did not dare to turn his head to look. He had already guessed who that ghost-like person was that had silently appeared behind him. Back then, he had seen the dossier on this person's murders on the snowy plains. He knew that if he turned his head, his neck would definitely be bitten through. On the brink of life and death, Zhou Tong no longer cared about the 2 poisons in his body. He squeezed out even the last drop of true essence. In the room enveloped in a sea of blood, a massive wave rose up to the heavens. With a howl, he transformed into a bloody light and charged out the door. With a cracking sound, the elegant sword that had pierced through his body was actually broken by the momentum of his forward charge. The person who appeared behind him like a ghost didn't even have time to twist his neck. There were only a few sounds and several spurts of blood. Countless mechanisms were activated at the same time. Several array intents displayed their final effects, exploding like fireworks. The fake mountains and screen walls of the small courtyard all collapsed, followed closely by the house itself. Dust filled the air, the bamboo snapped into several pieces, the stone slabs shattered, and even the sunlight seemed to shatter. Zhou Tong fell by the broken bamboo by the wall. He used his fastest speed to push away a fake bamboo shoot, and the remaining walls of the courtyard all collapsed. He was blasted out of the courtyard by the wave of qi and landed heavily on the snowy ground. His body was covered in blood amidst the pure white snow. This scene was not beautiful, nor did it make one feel heroic. His blood was black and suffused with a foul stench. It flowed from the sword wound on his chest. His back was even more wretched. His clothes were in tatters, and his flesh was badly mangled. 10 claw marks were so deep that white bone could be faintly seen. Zhou Tong had lived for many years, but this was his most miserable moment. But in his eyes that were filled with fear and pain, he finally saw some hope, even wild joy, because he had finally arrived on the street. Dust filled the air, and stone fragments madly danced. In a very short time, the entire small courtyard had become ruins. Mou was not surprised by this. She knew that a person like Zhou Tong, on the verge of death, would assuredly cause a great disturbance. Moreover, this truly was his home ground. She was somewhat surprised that someone had actually followed Zhou Tong out of the tunnels. Even though she had a detailed map of the tunnels of Zhou prison, she had never thought about going down. But when she realized that it was Zhixiu, the unexpected became a logical conclusion. She knew that this wolf cub was most skilled at tracking and hiding, and then killing. She and Zhixiu glanced at each other, then walked out of the courtyard. He was injured, but not too seriously. Zhou Tong's cultivation was far higher than Mou's and Zhixiu's. Under normal circumstances, even if Mou and Zhixiu worked together, they would not necessarily be a match for him. Mou and Zhixiu were the people in the world who wanted him dead the most. They had made ample preparations and had chosen to use poison at the same time. Even in these circumstances, Zhou Tong had still survived and escaped from the small courtyard. However, Mou and Zhixiu were not worried because Zhou Tong only had half a life left and was not far from death. When they walked onto the street, Zhou Tong was still not far ahead. Zhou Tong had already become a man of blood. Let alone using a swift technique, he could not even walk very fast. He staggered forward. Blood incessantly dripped onto the snow. Its color was very dark, just like ink. Zhixiu had disappeared to some unknown place, and the shadows along the street seemed somewhat distorted. Mou arrived behind him, her black hair slightly disheveled, lightly brushing against her pale face. She said nothing, expressionlessly gazing at his back. She had returned to the capital to prepare to perish together with Zhou Tong. He had not expected that she would still be alive. She did not care if others discovered that she had returned to the capital, did not care if others saw her. Zhou Tong knew that she had come. He strove to walk faster, but he could not. The snowy street was very quiet. The only thing that could be heard was his heavy breathing. Mou gripped her broken sword and chopped down. With a paw, Zhou Tong heavily fell onto the snowy ground, a bloody wound appearing on his left rib. He still did not turn his head. Gasping for breath, he struggled to his feet and continued forward. There was an estate on the side of the street. Its gate was vermilion, and a rather damaged white banner stretched out from the corner of the wall. With a creak, the gate of the estate was pushed open, and someone walked out. Zhou Tong knew who this estate belonged to. His blood-stained face showed no change in emotion as he continued forward. A sword glow flashed once more, and another wound appeared on his body. Then he fell once more into the snow. A cry of alarm came from the stone steps. Zhou Tong lay in the snow, painfully coughing, blood constantly splashing into the air. After some time, with a low howl like that of a wild beast, he once more stood up from the snow. Mou was right behind him, her hand gripping her sword. Her sword was stained with his blood. He did not turn his head, only looked forward, his rapid and painful gasps for breath. The snowy street was so clear and spacious. As far as the eye could see, there was not a single person. Where was he going? Chapter 7:23. There was a long street in the northern part of the capital called the Road of Peace. This place was not far from the imperial city, and after crossing the nearby Sanchi Bridge, one could reach the Vermilion Bird Avenue, making it very convenient to go to court. For countless years, This street had been inhabited by high officials and nobles. From the previous dynasty until now, nothing had changed. It was just that as the situation changed, the people living in the courtyards on the side of the street constantly changed. In the era of the Orthodox dynasty, the large courtyard with the best position on the road of peace, the one closest to the imperial city, naturally belonged to the Tianhai clan. After the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, the Tianhai clan had not changed much, but several miles to the east, many courtyards had changed owners and were undergoing major renovations. This was because the Prince of Xiang, the Prince of Zhongshan, and 10 some other princes had already moved in. The easternmost courtyard on the Road of Peace, the one closest to the scholar trees, was the Shui estate. As the Tianhai divine empress's most trusted #1 person in the great Zhou army, Shui Xingchuan naturally had the right to enjoy this sort of treatment. The Shui clan naturally could not continue to protect this courtyard. The new owner might be some prince or some divine general, but who knew? Madame Shui also did not know who the new owner of this courtyard was, but she knew that this was unavoidable. She had never had any extravagant hopes of continuing to live here, so she had long since made the appropriate preparations. She dismissed all the servants, and after the ceremony was over, she used the silver from her dowry to buy a small courtyard on the street outside 100 Flowers Lane. After doing all this, she originally believed that she could calm down, but when she heard the weeping at her side, she realized that peace was still an extravagant hope. She felt her head begin to ache, and she harshly asked, "Are you crying because you're in pain, or because you're crying because you're sad?" The young lady of the Shui clan who had been driven out of the assistant minister's estate had remained in the Shui estate the entire time, washing her face in tears. Today, when she heard the news, she cried even more. Madame Shui's question frightened her. Timidly raising her head, she asked, sobbing, "Mother, what's wrong?" Her eyes had long since turned red, and her voice had become somewhat hoarse. For some reason, her face was covered in wounds, as if she had been beaten. Madame Shui pointed at the bruises on her face that had still not disappeared and angrily said, "If you're crying because you're in pain from being beaten, then that means you're useless and unworthy of being your father's daughter. If you're crying because he's dead, then that means there's something wrong with your head. Is it worth it to cry for this sort of person?" The news that Assistant Minister Wei of the Ministry of Rights had been killed by Qin Changsheng and Wang had already spread throughout the entire capital. Every time Miss Shui thought of her husband's ruthlessness, she would be extremely angry, wishing for nothing more than for him to die. But when she suddenly found out that the man was really dead, thinking about all these years, she couldn't help but feel sad, feeling that her life was really bitter. Listening to her mother's words, the eldest daughter of the Shui family also felt that she was really useless. But why did President Qin kill him? Shouldn't he have beaten that man up and brought him to the Shui mansion to apologize to him, swearing to the heavens that he would treat him very, very well in the future? Just like before, an unexpected howl interrupted her messy thoughts. The howl came from the courtyard next to the Shui residence. Soon after, there was the rumbling of countless collisions, and one could faintly hear the rumbling of wind and thunder. Then the house collapsed and dust filled the air. The eldest daughter of the Shui clan was stupefied. Her face was pale, and she no longer had the mind to grieve or weep. Madame Shui's gaze fell on the dust rising from the neighboring courtyard, a look of doubt on her face. The collapse of the neighboring courtyard had not affected the Shui estate, but for some reason, she felt that it had something to do with the Shui estate. Many years ago, when the divine empress bestowed this residence on the Road of Peace to Shui Xingchuan, the courtyard that was one wall away also began to undergo renovations. The gate to this courtyard opened in the south among the scholar trees. Normal people wouldn't even be able to discover it, and if one walked along the Road of Peace, they would only feel that this courtyard was a part of the Shui estate. The owner of this courtyard was very mysterious and never interacted with others. Even today, Madame Shui did not know who he was. She could only vaguely guess that it was related to her clan, because she had personally heard Xue Xingchuan make 2 corresponding arrangements and give the most severe warnings. She had even once suspected that this mysterious neighbor might be the rumored crown prince Xiaoming. Of course, later on, it was proven that this conjecture was wrong. The collapse of the house brought up countless clouds of dust. The broken bamboo was like a broken bough breaking into pieces of emerald green bamboo that fell into the garden of the Xue estate. Madame Xue hugged her frightened daughter and softly comforted her. The neighboring courtyard was still collapsing, rumbling incessantly as if someone had fallen from the courtyard onto the street. Madame Xue did not know why the neighboring courtyard had collapsed, but seeing this terrifying disturbance, she thought to herself that even if that person managed to escape, he would probably be injured. She ordered the steward to open the door and see if that person needed help. The sky was approaching dusk and somewhat gloomy. Fortunately, the snow on the street was still so white, so one could clearly see that blood-covered person, even though that person's blood seemed to be black. When the steward pushed open the door to the Xue estate, the first scene that Madame Xue and her daughter saw was this gory scene. The young lady of the Xue clan cried out in alarm, repeatedly yelling, "Quickly come and save him!" After saying this, she saw a very strange scene. A beauty in a palace dress appeared behind the bloody man without a sound. The body of this beauty was also bleeding and covered in dust. It somewhat obscured her face, but it could not obscure her beauty. Who was she? What was going on here? Just when the young lady of the Xue clan was in a daze, the beauty raised the broken sword in her hand and slashed at the bloody person. A spurt of blood shot into the snow. It was not much, not enough to kill the bloody person on the spot, but not so little that it could not be seen. "Murder!" The young lady of the Xue clan cried out in fear, and then her voice came to a screeching halt. Madame Xue covered her mouth, her hand constantly trembling, but she used great strength to prevent her daughter from making a single sound. She could clearly see that the beauty dressed in palace attire was Mou, and that bloody person, Zhou Tong. It turned out that the neighboring courtyard belonged to Zhou Tong. She finally understood this point, and when she thought about how Xue Xingchuan had also concealed this matter from her, she couldn't help but become even angrier, her body trembling even more violently. "It's Zhou Tong!" Madame Xue's voice was somewhat indistinct and cold. The young lady of the Xue clan stiffened. As she gazed at this bloody scene on the snowy street, her hands gradually clenched. Zhou Tong was like a wounded beast on the verge of death. He let out a rather strange growl as he painfully crawled out of the snow and took a few more steps forward. He knew that this was the Xue estate, knew that the mother and daughter on the stone steps were his sister-in-law and niece, so he would not turn his head to glance in that direction. He would not plead for leniency from them, as that would be seeking his own humiliation. He also did not want them to see him like a stray dog. He wanted to leave as quickly as possible, but at this moment, a shrill gust of wind from a sword landed on his left thigh. His flesh was cut horizontally, blood slowly flowing out like porridge from a pot. He heavily kneeled in the snow splashing from his knees. The young lady of the Xue clan once more cried out in alarm at this sight, but this time besides fear, there was even more joy. Chapter 724. A wounded beast on the verge of death would let out a strange growl because it wanted to keep as much sound in its throat as possible, not wanting its weakness to be heard by anyone. But when his thigh muscles were severed and he fell into the snow in front of the Xue estate, Zhou Tong could no longer hold back and let out a scream tinged with pain. This scream was drowned out by the Xue clan's young lady's cry of alarm, but it was still so clear that everyone present could hear it. The Xue clan's young lady felt even more delighted, and the Xue clan steward was so excited that his entire body began to tremble. Logically speaking, Madame Xue, who should have had the greatest reaction, was able to maintain her composure. She quietly gazed at Zhou Tong lying in the snow. It was very quiet in front of the Xue estate. Only Zhou Tong's heavy breathing could be heard. After an unknown period of time, Zhou Tong crawled up from the snow and continued to stagger along the west side of the street, leaving behind a trail of blood. Mo Yu walked to the stone steps, turned to Madame Xue, and nodded her head in greeting. A few years ago, Xue Xingchuan and she had both been the most popular personages of the Tianhai dynasty, so the two naturally interacted. Madame Xue very seriously returned her greeting, saying, "Thank you." And Mo Yu said nothing. Nodding her head again, she followed Zhou Tong. Madame Xue gazed at the warm, yet gloomy sky and thought of that day. She silently said her thanks to Qin Changsheng. With the end of the Tianhai dynasty, her husband had gone from a loyal subject of the great Zhou dynasty to a traitor. And Zhou Tong had clearly been a traitor, but he had become an important minister of the great Zhou dynasty. This was naturally unfair, but in this world where no one dared to pay homage to traitors, just who would seek justice for a traitor? That day in the Orthodox Academy, she had said that she hated that Zhou Tong did not die. This was a true hatred, a hatred tinged with despair, a hatred that seeped into her bones. At the time, Qin Changxing had said nothing, had not comforted her, only calmly gazed at her. When sending her off from the Orthodox Academy, he had requested that she not leave the capital. This was a promise. He would kill Zhou Tong and let her see it. So Madame Xue did not return to her hometown, but remained in the capital. She wanted to see this scene with her own eyes. It was at this moment that she finally saw it. From the moment that Xue Xingchuan was poisoned to death to his corpse to being exposed to the public, she had rarely wept. But at this time, 2 lines of hot and somewhat scalding tears flowed from her eyes. She took one last look at the scene of Zhou Tong struggling for his life in the snow, then ordered the steward, "Close the door." Miss Xue was a little surprised. She held her mother's arm and said, "Mother, I want to see more. I haven't seen enough." Everyone wanted to see their most powerful and invincible enemy reduced to a wounded wild dog. Who wouldn't be able to get enough of that? Enough. It was hard to tell if Madame Xue was talking about this matter or her daughter, but she turned and entered the estate. The gate slowly closed, blocking many things and memories outside. There was snow everywhere on the road of peace, and blood was everywhere on the snow. More and more blood flowed out of Zhou Tong's body, so much so that the poison became much fainter, and the blood gradually regained some of its red color. More and more bloody wounds appeared on his body. They were densely packed, and he looked incomparably miserable. These wounds were very particular. Their depth and position were enough to make him feel excruciating pain, but they were not enough to immediately end his life. When she attacked, Mo Yu's beautiful face was devoid of emotion, her face indifferent to the extreme. Coupled with her blood-stained palace gown, she looked like the maid of the god of death. Occasionally, sword glows would illuminate the gloomy street. Zhou Tong arduously advanced through the snow. He had long since found it impossible to stand firm, and often had to use both his hands and feet to move forward. It seemed like he might collapse at any moment, never to stand again. He could no longer suppress his pain and fear and maintain the silence of an old wolf. Every time a sword glow lit up, a wretched howl could be heard. This was the most thorough form of humiliation and torture to the body and mind, a torture that would seemingly never end. This had always been the death of 1,000 cuts. If it were anyone else, no matter how strong their will was, they would have crumbled at this moment. Even if they did not kneel and beg for mercy from their enemies, they would probably do everything in their power to commit suicide. But Zhou Tong did not, because he had tortured and humiliated far too many people in his life, had inflicted far too many tortures on the innocent. He had seen the darkest and most painful scenes of the world, had experienced the true hell. His heart was like a stone that had been soaked in poisonous water for 70,000 years. Every patch of moss growing on it the embodiment of evil. Even though Mo Yu's cruel methods made his body and soul tremble, it was still impossible for him to surrender, whether to her or to fate. Before death arrived, he would never willingly accept it. On the contrary, he was still like a beggar, thirsting for the final victory. As long as he could crawl through this long street of blood, he would win. He screamed, and then he said to himself in his heart. The twilight grew thicker and thicker, turning into night. The white snow on the road of peace reflected the starlight, but it was not enough to illuminate this world. At some point, a dim yellow light suddenly descended and fell on Zhou Tong's body. Through the terrifying wounds, one could clearly see his bones. The distant light did not have any warmth, but Zhou Tong suddenly felt his body grow warm. In the small courtyard, his eyesight had already suffered severe damage. It was a blur, and he could only make out a rough outline. However, he was very sure that the light was to his right, which was to the north of the Road of Peace. This was the estate that Grand Preceptor Cheng had left in the capital before he retired. Recently, it had been seized by a prince with overwhelming power and had become a prince's estate. He used a quarter of an hour, enduring the pain of 1,000 cuts, to crawl a distance of some 60 zhang. Finally, he left the boundaries of the Shui estate and arrived here. He could endure it because there was hope. From the very beginning, his hope had been here. His vision was still blurry, but his eyes lit up as if some kind of flame had been ignited by that light. He still had a bit of true essence left, hidden in the deepest parts of his meridians. No matter how sharp Mo's sword was or how callous her methods were, it was useless because it was not enough for him to escape this desperate situation. At this time, the dew-like true essence began to burn, bringing his body up from the snowy ground, swiftly rushing towards that light. He rushed to the prince's estate, but he no longer had any strength left. He fell to the bottom of the stone steps. "I am Zhou Tong, Prince of Zhongshan, save me." He used the last of his strength to yell out these words. He had never felt despair. Over the countless years, he had played with the thoughts of countless people in the palm of his hand. He was keenly aware that neither Mou nor Zheshio would allow him to die immediately, especially when they were in complete control of the situation. This was because they would not be able to vent the tyrannical emotions and desire for vengeance that existed in the depths of their hearts. This was his chance, and he had to seize it. He angrily and derisively thought, "Even if you princes want to pretend that you can't hear my screams, can you say that you can't hear my cries for help?" Right now, it was difficult for him to say a single word, but he did not directly yell for help, but for a prince to save him. He did not even forget to yell for that prince's name, all so that the prince would appear. "I am a minister of the great Zhou dynasty, Zhou Tong. I am in danger. Prince of Zhongshan, save me." At some point, the clouds in the sky had gathered together, obscuring the starlight and causing the snow to fall once more. The gate of the Prince of Zhongshan's estate opened, as did many other gates on both sides of the Road of Peace. Many lanterns appeared in the darkness, so bright that they were somewhat dazzling. The long street in the darkness transformed into a silver river. In the river, Zhou Tong could no longer suppress his emotions. An intoxicated expression appeared on his face as he gave a neurotic laugh. With several dozen wuxes, the experts of the prince's estate arrived on the street. Mou walked out of the snow, several zhang away from Zhou Tong. Zhou Tong looked at her, his blood-stained face revealing a fierce expression. "How will you kill me now? It's time for someone else to kill you." His eyes expressed his meaning very clearly. Mou did not even glance at him. The night wind gently ruffled her palace dress, causing snow to fall on her temples. She gazed at the brightly lit Road of Peace, at the Tensum princely estates, and said, "The Empress has treated all of you badly, but there is at least one benefit." These words were spoken to those princes who had yet to show themselves. The sons of Empress Yen are all still alive. The lantern light illuminated her face, making it even more beautiful and moving. But her expression was still cold and indifferent, her face brimming with toughness, faintly similar to that of the deceased. Not a single one is left, and all of you are still alive. It was the Empress who allowed all of you to live until tonight. Tonight, I want all of you to return this benefit. I want him dead." The light snow fell without a sound, just like the silence of the long street at this moment. After some time, someone in the lantern light waved their hand. Zhou Tong's vision was blurry, so he could not clearly make out this person's appearance. He could only see that this person was wearing a bright yellow robe. The Prince of Zhongshan's estate had not closed its gates, but those who had walked out had all retreated. What was going on here? Zhou Tong felt this to be absurd, thinking, "Is your highness not afraid of angering the venerable Taoist?" Mo Yu walked up behind him. Fear once more enveloped his body. Gasping for breath, he crawled forward. There were 10-some princely estates on the road of peace, the Tianhai clan, and the ministers. The Prince of Zhongshan was a madman, but was everyone else a madman? He crawled and crawled, crawled and crawled, wanting to crawl to the next place where the lights were fading. But when he was still very far away, the lights there were extinguished. It was to the extent that the prince's estate had even closed its gates. Soon after, the heavy gates began to slowly close, and the lights on the street began to go out one by one. The darkness grew deeper and deeper. Zhou Tong grew colder and colder. He crawled through the cold and wet snow, through the long blood-stained street. All his silence and perseverance had begun with hope, but had ended in despair. Chapter 7:25. Zhou Tong struggled to crawl through the snow, his throat gurgling, ultimately transforming into a weak, sobbing yell. "Save me! Who will save me?" His previous wretched cries had more or less been faked. But from the underground Zhou prison, to the small courtyard bathed in sunlight, to the long street covered in snow, he had constantly fled, chasing after hope, only to be disappointed again and again. Now he finally despaired, his will collapsing like a dam broken by a flood. As he sobbed in pain, some of the blood on his face was washed away by his old tears, and then frozen by the cold wind, turning it into a viscous shell. It was a very unsightly sight. His sobs were like the cries of an owl, extremely unpleasant to hear. As the most famous, ruthless official, Zhou Tong had never forgiven this world. He had never shown the slightest bit of kindness towards this world. He had saved this world once, so naturally this world was also absolutely cold to him. It would not forgive him, and no one would come to save him. The lights on the road of peace gradually faded, and the road ahead of him was dark. Several estates still had their doors open. The one closest to Zhou Tong was the Prince of Zhongshan's estate. The depths of the estate were brightly lit. The Prince of Zhongshan sat on a chair, a frozen pear in his hand. As he recalled Zhou Tong's miserable appearance in front of the estate's gate, he felt very happy, and even the pear seemed a little sweeter. A Wang Fu subordinate at the side wanted to say something, but hesitated. He said, "This subordinate still feels that it is not appropriate. What's wrong?" "I've wanted to tear that old dog to pieces for a long time." The Prince of Zhongshan fell silent for a while, then added, "And Mou's words are reasonable. Whether I'm feeling or not, the fact that I can live to this day is a favor." This official was very shocked. He had not expected that the prince would actually be moved by Mou's words. It must be known that of the princes scattered throughout the provinces and counties, the Prince of Zhongshan's situation was the most miserable. Compared to those princes of the side branches that had been poisoned to death, he truly had survived, but he had been forced to eat shit and feign madness. This was an even more terrifying experience than death. Is shit delicious? Of course not. But did you ever think that if that woman could force me to eat shit back then, how could she not know that I was feigning madness? The Prince of Zhongshan expressionlessly replied, "She naturally knew that I was pretending to be crazy. The reason she didn't expose me was because she liked seeing me eat shit, but at the very least she didn't have me die. Compared to death, what does eating shit count for?" Those of us who were born in the emperor's family. Which one of us doesn't have the ability to eat shit? More than a dozen princely estates had closed their doors for different reasons, keeping Zhou Tong outside. The most honest and cowardly of them all, the Prince of Luoyang, was hiding in the deepest part of the third layer of bedding. On one hand, he was worried about the safety of his acquaintance, Mou, while on the other, he was silently speaking ill of Zhou Tong. The most experienced, prudent, and authoritative Prince of Xiang was not even in the prince's estate today. The gate to the Prince of Xiang's estate was open. The young Prince Chen Lu stood in the light, his expression calm, his brow furrowed in worry. Zhou Tong crawled across the snow, and Mou followed behind him. Prince Chen Lu ignored Zhou Tong and said to Mou, "It's about time." Mou ignored him and continued to use her sword as a whip, urging the bloodied Zhou Tong forward. At the end of the road of peace was an extremely large estate, decorated with exquisite and luxurious decorations. Even the newly constructed estate of the Prince of Xiang could not compare. This was the Tianhai clan, the most powerful clan on the continent in the last 200 years. The important figures of the Tianhai clan, such as clan leader Tianhai Chenwu and several elders, would naturally not remain in the capital at such a sensitive time. They had long since gone to the estate on the outskirts of the capital. The gate was wide open and brightly lit. Tianhai Xingxue stood under the light, his clothes whiter than snow. Zhou Tong crawled across the snow in front of the gate and glanced at him, his eyes venomous. But whether it was pleading for help or cursing, he no longer had the strength to speak. A tinkling laugh rose up, gradually turning into sobs. The Princess of Ping was held behind Tianhai Xingxue. After the coup in the palace, she had been brought back by the Tianhai clan. It was said that after some time, she might be married off to Prince Chenlu. As she watched Zhou Tong struggle through the snow, she laughed somewhat crazily, her beautiful face covered in tears. "You're like a dog today." She shouted at Zhou Tong, but it also seemed like a curse. Tianhai Xingxue did not stop her, only put his arm around her shoulder, not allowing her to impulsively attack Zhou Tong. He looked at the blood-covered Mou and solemnly said, "It's about time." This was the same meaning as Prince Chenlu's words. Mou was a target the imperial court had to capture, placed at the top of the list. Mou still said nothing. She had never thought about leaving the capital alive. Zhou Tong's mind was no longer clear. Even despair and rage had withdrawn from his mind. In his final moment, he only had one question. Why did no one come to save him? Principal Shang only needed to move a finger to keep me alive, so why did I have to die? Just like those massive beasts on the snowy plains of the north. When they sensed that they were on the verge of death, they would often subconsciously head to the place they were most familiar with and wait for death to descend. To Zhou Tong, the place he was most familiar with was naturally the small courtyard in the alley of the Northern Military Department. So he headed there. That place was actually very close to the Road of Peace. When the Shui estate was holding the ceremony, he had been able to quickly lead his subordinates there precisely because of this reason. But if he had to crawl across the snow-covered street, the road would become extremely long. Moreover, sword glows would occasionally flash behind him. Mou still occasionally swung her sword, and every time her sword descended, it would cut off a piece of flesh from Zhou Tong's body. Zhou Tong's blood was almost completely drained, his screams growing weaker and weaker until they could no longer be heard. He was like a senseless wooden man, incessantly crawling across the snow. A crowd of onlookers appeared on both sides of the street. They looked at the bloodied Zhou Tong, who was constantly being cut and humiliated. After the initial shock, it turned into some sort of extreme pleasure. Every time Mou swung her sword and cut off a piece of Zhou Tong's flesh, the crowd would cheer. Snow was still falling from the sky, but the night sky to the west was already filled with stars. The ground of the courtyard in the alley of the Northern Military Department had already been destroyed, cut into countless pieces by countless sharp swords. Zhou prison had truly been destroyed. Whether it was the buildings on the ground, the dungeons, or the cells hidden in the deepest depths of the earth, all of them had revealed their true appearances. Those instruments of torture covered in blood and human fragments, those severed limbs and corpses, had formed a purgatory on earth. Shui, he had opened the doors to all the cells ahead of time. The lightly injured prisoners had scattered in all directions, leaving only those heavily injured and on the verge of death behind. Those prisoners who had undergone countless cruel tortures were the most direct proof of this hell on earth. Starlight spilled down on Zhou prison, a holy and beautiful contrast against the filthy and repulsive blood. A deathly stillness. Xiaoda and the experts of the army had killed people like flies, and the assassins of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets were extremely sinister, but they had never seen such a miserable sight. Even the officials of the Department for Purging Officials felt rather disgusted by those blood-soaked cells and those grotesquely shaped instruments of torture, even though they had clearly seen them many times and personally carried out countless punishments. Perhaps it was because these bloody and repulsive scenes had never been exposed to the light of day like they were now. There was no sign of Zhou Tong. Many noises could be heard from outside the courtyard, but there was also a strange sense of tranquility. Qin Changxing was covered in blood, his own blood or someone else's. He walked out of the courtyard. All his swords had already returned to their sheaths, but no one stopped him. The streets were packed with people, a dense mass of people. It was just that there was a large, empty space in the center. Zhou Tong lay on the snow on the verge of death. His body was covered in wounds that no one could clearly count. It would not be an exaggeration to say that he had been hacked to pieces. Qin Changxing walked up to him. With great difficulty, Zhou Tong raised his head to glance at Qin Changxing. He actually recognized who Qin Changxing was, and a final hope appeared in his heart. In his view, Qin Changxing assuredly hated him, or else he would not have been so determined to kill him. He was not afraid that Qin Changxing hated him, only that Qin Changxing did not hate him enough. He firmly believed that he had a deep understanding of the human heart. The more one hated, the more one could not bear to see an enemy die. Come, cut me a few more times, torture me, humiliate me, castrate me, feed me lard, raise me into the most unsightly of fatties, and then squeeze the fat out of me to light a lamp. Anything is fine, as long as you don't kill me on the spot. I beg you. Perhaps because he had heard Zhou Tong's thoughts, Qin Changxing unsheathed his sword. There was no humiliation or torture, no callous vengeance, only a bright sword glow, a clean killing intent. With a swish, a thin line of blood appeared on Zhou Tong's neck, and then it rapidly spread and widened, ultimately separating his head from his body. Zhou Tong was dead, his eyes wide open in confusion. He was probably confused. How could it be so simple? Qin Changxing did not give Zhou Tong's corpse another glance. He walked up to Mou and said, "You've come." Mou replied, "Yes, I've come." She felt rather tired and sat down on the snow. Qin Changxing also felt rather tired, so he sat down on the snow next to her. The shadows at the corner of the street slightly rippled and Zhixio appeared. He was also very tired, but he did not sit down on the snow because he knew that there would still be a battle. The earth quaked, the snow loosened, and the sound of hooves thundered like a storm. Several hundred black-armored Imperial Guard soldiers had arrived. Xiaoda and the other experts of the Imperial Court were standing around. 10 some blue-clothed Taoists had also arrived at some point, their cultivations unfathomable. Suddenly, there was the sound of hooves, and a young eunuch arrived on horseback, his hand holding a bright yellow imperial edict. The imperial edict naturally came from the palace. The young eunuch announced Zhou Tong's crimes in front of everyone, a total of 22. The 22 crimes had been calculated after the fact. At the time, no one could clearly remember the specifics. Everyone was in a state of shock, whether it was the officials of the Department for Purging Officials or the soldiers of the Imperial Guard. Qin Changxing also did not remember the scene at the time. He only remembered that the young eunuch's voice was rather sharp and erratic, sometimes near and sometimes far. In short, it did not seem real. He also faintly remembered that the imperial edict seemed to mention death by 1,000 cuts at the very end. But the current Zhou Tong had already become a badly mangled corpse on the snow, his head and body severed in two. There was no way to express his gratitude. 1. I wish everyone a happy new year, the health of your entire family, and good luck in everything. 2. This chapter was written very pleasantly. 3. I did not ask for a monthly vote this year. Today there is still 1 hour left. I have nothing to do, so I ask everyone for a monthly vote. I ask everyone to help me vote. Of course, next year I will continue to not ask for a vote, just for this 1 hour. 4. The title of today's chapter is not bad. When I wrote it, I suddenly thought of the fierce blade in the snow. Chapter 7:26. The reading of the imperial edict concluded, but the scene was still as quiet as a deathly stillness. The gazes of the crowd rested on the snowy ground, seeing Zhou Tong's head and body separated from his body. Their emotions were shocked and complicated to the extreme. It would not be an exaggeration to describe this person as guilty. This person was naturally guilty, but no one had expected the imperial court to declare him guilty. The crowd then turned to the young man and woman, sitting side by side on the snowy ground. The hands holding the reins of the great Zhou's black cavalry were somewhat stiff. They didn't know what to do next. Should they charge or put down the spears in their hands? The redcoat cavalry and officials of the department for purging officials were pale as if their parents had died. The assassins from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets and the experts of the military all turned to Xiaoda, wanting to know just what was going on. Changes in the situation were always so sudden that even the people involved would be caught unprepared. Even Chen Changsheng and Mo Yu were momentarily at a loss. Only when the young eunuch left did they faintly understand. If they had known this would happen, there would have been no need to act like this. Many people would probably feel this way, but they would not. Only those idiots would think this way. Mo Yu combed back her somewhat disheveled hair and gazed at the crowd that still surrounded them. She gave a derisive smile and said, if Zhou Tong was still alive, he would still be an important minister of the court. Only when we killed him would he be skinned and his flesh torn apart, his bones used to make soup. This truly has always been Master's way of doing things. Chen Changsheng felt that tonight's snowy wind was somewhat bone-chilling. Gazing in the direction of the imperial palace, he continued after a moment of silence. When we were little, senior brother and I believed him to be a poor Taoist priest. Because he was too poor, his view of all things in the world was rather extreme, and his conduct was rather stingy. Only now do I understand that this should be called exhaustion. The snowstorm enveloped the imperial palace. The earth dragons in the side halls were burning very hot, as warm as spring. A few imperial edicts from years past were placed on the table. I never thought that your junior brother would actually be able to kill Zhou Tong. His performance has exceeded my expectations, and I'm very satisfied. I'm even more satisfied with the method Mo Yu and him used to kill Zhou Tong. The more cruel and unyielding their methods, the more shocking this story will be, and the more people will remember it. This naturally includes Zhou Tong's evil deeds. Shang Xingzhou looked at the young emperor behind the table and said, although Zhou Tong betrayed your mother and worked for me, no one can deny that in the past many years he has been your mother's spokesperson. Thus, his evil is your mother's evil. The more Chen Changsheng displays his evil, the worse your mother's image will be. As the leader of the conspiracy to overthrow your mother's rule, the less negative evaluation I will have. At the same time, the higher your junior brother's reputation is, the higher my reputation is. No matter how you look at it, tonight's matter is beneficial to me. I just need to issue that decree in a timely manner afterward. Yuren thought of the books in Xining Village's old temple, the fish in the stream, the beasts in the mountains, and fell silent. Shang Xingzhou continued. This method is rather petty, but it's not miserly. It's just making the best use of everything. Yuren raised his head and made a few gestures with his hands. Could it be that, from the very beginning, everyone in the capital was being used by you? It wasn't like this at the beginning. Of course, I wanted to protect Zhou Tong, and I truly did intend to do some things tonight. Shang Xingzhou very patiently explained, but in this process the situation changed, so I also had to make corresponding changes. To cultivators, change was an unchanging law under the starry sky. All things in the world were constantly changing, and the situation of the times was no different. Even if it was only a few hours, many changes could occur, just like a river during the spring thawing. If one did not deal with it properly, even the sturdiest metal bridge would be washed away. Shang Xingzhou did not explain what those changes were. Perhaps because Chen Changxing's strength had surpassed everyone's expectations. He had endured for an entire day. Those swords had cut open the hard ground that had been frozen by the winter wind, exposing Zhou prison to the starlight. Perhaps because the Li Palace had remained quiet the entire time. The snow and clouds drifting in the sky were like a tamed flock of sheep, showing no intention of crossing the fence. Of course, the most likely reason was that Wang Pa had severed his arm, broken through, and killed Tai Shu on the Luo River. Moreover, the lights of the princely estates on the snowy road of peace had been extinguished one by one. Do you know why your master is called Shang Xingzhou? Shang Xingzhou suddenly asked. Yuren knew that Shang Xingzhou was not his master's true name. At least 600 years ago, he had been called Daoist Ji. The appearance of this name, or the acquisition of it, assuredly meant something. Before His Majesty returned to the Sea of Stars, he still did not forget those words. Water can carry a boat, but it can also capsize it. Shang Xingzhou's gaze rested on a certain place in the palace, seemingly returning to several hundred years ago. Everyone on the continent knew this famous saying, and Yuren was naturally no exception. He also knew that His Majesty in this saying was not his father, but his grandfather. That night His Majesty said to me, walking in the world is like rowing a boat in the ocean. One must be cautious and careful, and one must not go against the current, or else the boat will capsize. Shang Xingzhou very calmly said, Since everyone wants Zhou Tong dead, since this is the will of the people, I naturally have to comply. To the master and disciples of Xining Village's old temple, this was a very important word. This was the Tao they cultivated. Only tonight did Yuren understand that it originated from the saying, water can carry a boat, but it can also capsize it. Shang Xingzhou continued, Of course, following the current does not mean obeying. The boat only hopes that the water can be calmer, that there won't be too many waves, that there won't be too much resistance. Yuren gestured with his hands, but in the end the boat still has to revere the existence of water. The Duke of Wei once said, Resentment is not great, only people to be feared. To carry a boat and capsize it, one must be careful. How can one not fear? Shang Xingzhou looked into his eyes and said, But positions are relative. Since you are the boat, you cannot consider the feelings of the water too much. Yuren gestured. In the end, you still have to consider it, or else Sir would not have changed your mind. In everyone's view, I have already done all I could, but I was stopped by you and them. Shang Xingzhou's gaze fell on his waist, where the jade pendant the Qiushan clan head had offered as tribute. You young people are all gambling with your lives. You are like this, Mou is like this, Wang Pi is like this, and your junior brother is even more so. I raised your junior brother for 17 years, so how could I bear to kill him? I could only watch helplessly as he killed Zhou Tong. If anyone were to ask me about tonight's matter, I would be able to answer with a clear conscience. Yuren could no longer tell which of these words was true and which was false, but he understood. Zhou Tong was the ugliest and dirtiest stain on the body of the new dynasty. Qin Changsheng was the deepest and most difficult thorn in his master's heart. His master did not care who died, as long as he did not have to personally do it. Today, the several soul-stirring battles and pursuits in the capital were highly likely to shake the entire human world, but they had always been under his master's control. No matter how it changed, he would always be the final victor. If Wang had been killed by Tai Shu on the Luo River, this victory might have been perfect. This was not a situation that I planned, and I cannot control everything. After all, I am not a god, nor am I Emperor Taizong. Shang Xingzhou rejected Yu Ren's idea, saying, "Today was more like a lesson. If your majesty wishes to become a mighty person like Emperor Taizong, to lead the human race into an incomparably bright future, you must learn to sail with the current. No matter how much you loathe those foolish and idiotic commoners who cheer at the execution, you must still convince yourself that they are the true ocean. You must learn how to lead them, how to deceive them, how to borrow their strength to brave the waves and advance." Yu Ren could not completely understand this, nor was he very concerned about it. He only cared about one thing. He gestured with his hands and asked, "Master, do you really not like junior brother?" Shang Xingzhou thought this over, then smiled. "Yes, I don't like him. I really want him to die, or perhaps I should say that I wish that he had never lived. Happy New Year." Chapter 7:27. Everyone knew that Shang Xingzhou did not like his student, Qin Changsheng. As for the reason, Yu Ren and Qin Changsheng had roughly guessed at it, and their guesses were only getting deeper and deeper. But to the people of the world outside of Xining Village's old temple, this had always been an extremely difficult question to understand. From a personal point of view, Shang Xingzhou had raised Qin Changsheng from a young age. Even if all this had begun as a scheme, in his view, Qin Changsheng should still be more trustworthy than anyone else. Even if Shang Xingzhou wanted the human race to achieve unprecedented unification and thus defeat the demons, supporting Mu Jiosher to become pope and thus ally with the great Western continent was not necessarily better than Qin Changsheng ascending to the position of pope and the imperial court obtaining the full support of the Li Palace. No one could understand Shang Xingzhou's thoughts, and not even the pope's conjectures were tenable. After brushing past each other in the mausoleum of books in the morning light, all this had happened naturally. However, in the many stories that followed, Shang Xingzhou had never clearly expressed that he wanted Qin Changsheng to die, even if this was a secret known to the entire world. In the end, Shang Xingzhou had never expressed it on paper, never put it into action. Only tonight, when Shang Xingzhou admitted it to Yu Ren, did he reveal his intentions to the heavens and earth for the first time. The starry sky instantly dimmed as an invisible killing intent enveloped the capital. Qin Changsheng's life and death depended on one's own efforts, depended on Shang Xingzhou's attitude, and now it was inextricably linked to the life and death of another mighty figure. The Li Palace had long ago expressed its stance. The Pope would not permit Shang Xingzhou to harm Qin Changsheng. The problem was, how many more days did the Pope have left to live? In the end, nothing happened in the Li Palace that night. The starlight, torn apart by the snow and scattered clouds, fell upon Madame Mu's clothes, so beautiful that it seemed unreal. As dawn approached, Shang Xingzhou finally left the imperial palace, arriving between the gray eaves of the 5 beautiful and divine old temples of the Li Palace. Before he formally appeared, Madame Mu had already left, bringing with her a sky of snow and starlight. Other than the Pope, the Li Palace would only ever allow one saint to enter. To the orthodoxy, this would mean war. That night, Shang Xingzhou and the Pope engaged in a very long conversation, probably the last conversation of their lives. No one knew what they discussed or whether the imperial court and the orthodoxy had reached some sort of agreement. But starting from the next day, a warm spring breeze descended upon the capital ahead of time. An atmosphere known as reconciliation gradually began to spread. Zheshio and Mo, you were taken out of the court of judicial review. The former was sent by the army to the north, while the latter was returned to the Orange Garden and temporarily placed under surveillance. It was still winter, and the so-called spring breeze was naturally illusory. Everyone knew that this situation could last for a long time, and it could come to an abrupt end at any time. No one knew how many more days the Pope could live, nor did they know that once the Pope returned to the Sea of Stars, Shang Xingzhou would not keep the promise he made that night. The atmosphere in the capital gradually became tense. Many people seemed to have already seen the violent storm in advance. No, in the middle of winter it should be a blizzard. Amidst the uneasiness and anticipation, the new year approached. There was a heavy snowfall in the capital, turning the streets and buildings white. It was a beautiful sight. The Li Palace in the snow was even more beautiful. Chen Changsheng supported the Pope as they walked out of the secluded side hall and arrived at the largest plaza in the center of the group of palaces. In the past few years, he had often gone to the Li Palace, but the place he went to the most was this secluded side hall. This was his first time coming here with the Pope. The gray stone plaza was covered in snow like a carpet. The stone pillars that seemed scattered but were actually arranged in an orderly fashion were already covered in snow. Chun Changxing's spiritual sense could clearly sense that an extremely ancient and distant qi was concealed beneath the plaza. If this was an array, it was probably no weaker than the imperial design. Gazing into the distance, several palaces were faintly discernible in the wind and snow. He knew that those were the famous Grass Moon Hall, Pure Kasha Palace, Moss Institute. There were 6 halls in the Li Palace, and each hall had a precious treasure that represented the history and supreme authority of the orthodoxy. That was why the saying of the 6 prefects was gradually developed. He knew why the Pope had brought him here. The divine and vigorous qis in the Grass Moon Hall, Pure Kasha Palace, and other places were all expressing their allegiance to him. This year's snow is too great. The Pope's gaze pierced through the snow and fell upon the distant north, his wrinkled and spotted face revealing worry for the future. Shualao City is in internal strife, and the demons are unprecedentedly weak. This snowstorm will cause many tribes to waver and incite many battles. At the beginning of spring next year, the wolf cavalry will assuredly move south. The snowstorm was very beautiful, but also very cruel. The demons would assuredly suffer enormous losses, and with this rebellion, Shualao City would not be able to recover its strength in a short period of time. Under these circumstances, the Pope's conclusion that the demon army would invade the south next year didn't sound very logical. But Chen Changxing understood that this was something that would inevitably happen. The demon race was a crazy and terrifying race. The weaker they were, the more bloodthirsty and cruel they were. This was because they knew that this was the only way they could survive this most difficult period of time. The Pope sighed, "Since we hate each other, it's better to leave as soon as possible." These words had no head or tail, and only Chen Changxing could understand them. After the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, many people had speculated that he would leave the capital. In truth, he had always wanted to leave, but at the time he knew that his master would not let him leave unless he died. Now it seemed that the conversation between the 2 saints in the Li Palace had ultimately changed something. "Very well," he said. The Pope looked at him and said, "You are the successor I have chosen. No matter how many years pass, you must return." Chen Changxing replied, "When I am needed, I will return." The Pope said, "He wishes to speak with you." Chen Changxing thought it over, then replied, "Very well." The Li Palace glowed with light. The snow falling from the night sky seemed to become the heavenly flowers of the divine kingdom, so beautiful that it was intoxicating. The priests and cavalry of the orthodoxy, as well as the various levels of clergy, stood on the plaza, occasionally illuminated by the light, like a vast ocean under the morning sun. The great hall of light was even more dazzling, making it impossible to look directly at it. It was indescribably dignified. In the great hall, several thousand cardinals and archbishops bowed, their faces filled with piety and reverence. The stone wall slowly opened. Under the gazes of the 12 sages and the statues of the heroic spirits of the divine kingdom, The Pope and Qin Changxing walked out from the light. The Pope took the divine crown from Mao Cheyu's hands and placed it on Qin Changxing's head. Qin Changxing gripped the divine staff and walked to the very front. He began to receive blessings and to give them. His body was somewhat stiff, but his expression was extremely serious, his movements meticulous. He had not made a single mistake, even the tiniest request in the Taoist scriptures. It could be called perfect. Chapter 728. Qin Changxing stood in the light at the very front. The Pope was behind him. In the great hall, several thousand bishops knelt on the ground like a tide. In the plaza, tens of thousands of orthodoxy cavalry and priests knelt on the ground like a tide. Outside the Li Palace, tens of thousands of believers knelt on the ground like a tide. At this sight, the Pope slowly narrowed his eyes, as if he had drunk a fine wine, very satisfied and happy. His eyes narrowed until they closed, and then they never opened again. At this point, no one could see the vast sea of stars in those old eyes anymore. Qin Changxing turned his head, the hand gripping the divine staff, faintly trembling. Mao Cheyu supported the Pope's body and shook his head at him. There was a faint disturbance in the nearby crowd, but there was no chaos. With Enlin and the other archbishops at the lead, everyone continued to kneel, but there was the occasional sound of weeping. The chanting that purified the Tao heart, the weeping of reminiscence and sorrow, drifted higher and higher in the majestic, great hall of light, and then was temporarily invited back to the mortal world by the toll of a bell. The sacred bell of the Li Palace, the Bureau of Ecclesiastic Education, and the Heavenly Tao Academy all rang at the same time. The sound of the bell swiftly spread to the entire capital and then to even further places, sending the news of the Pope's return to the Sea of Stars to every corner of the continent. Clack, 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 clack. Countless sounds of metal grinding against each other seemed to resound at the same time. The orthodoxy cavalry in the plaza between the Li Palace and the palace unsheathed their weapons, a black tide rising from the sea of people. Whether it was the divine crossbows, spears, or swords, they were all cold and sharp. They pointed straight at the night sky, at those millions of silent and unchanging stars. This was not a demonstration of the human world to the sea of stars, but a show of support. In other words, this was a grand and majestic procession, sending the sovereign 1,000 li away. The Grass Moon Hall, the Pure Kasha Palace, the Moss Institute, the Clear Water Tile Platform, the Hall of the Heavenly Tao, and the Autumn Residence were the 6 most important palaces of the Li Palace. At this moment, 6 extremely divine and grand qis emerged from these palaces and soared into the cold and lonely night sky. Then they met somewhere and became 6 visible rays of light. The colors of these rays of light were not the same. They seemed like a rainbow. No one had ever seen a rainbow in the night. The people kneeling on the ground in the Li Palace and the people kneeling in various places in the capital all raised their heads, shocked by this phenomenon in the sky. They sorrowfully thought, perhaps this is the human world's final farewell to His Holiness the Pope? Qin Changxing knew that it wasn't a rainbow but power. The moment those 6 qis emerged from the Grass Moon Hall and the other 6 palaces, he and all the cultivators of star condensation and above in the capital clearly sensed this power. This power came from the treasures of the orthodoxy in the 6 palaces and also from the ground between the Li Palace. To be more precise, it came from the array beneath the ground. Taoism had existed for countless years and had been revered as the national religion for close to 1,000 years. In the past, it had also been the national religion of several famous dynasties. In terms of historical heritage and rich accumulation of resources, in certain aspects, even the current imperial court might not be able to compare to it. It was not strange for it to have this kind of formation and many unknown divine artifacts. For example, the torch stuck at the head of the bed, the white sun flame. This sacred artifact of the demons had been stored in the Lingyan Pavilion for many years and was an important part of the imperial design. On the night of the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, The Tianhai Divine Empress had thrown out the Frost God's spear and destroyed the Lingyan Pavilion. The portraits in the pavilion had all been burned to ash, and the Frost God's spear had gone missing. People believed that it had probably been hidden away in the imperial palace. But who could have expected that the white sun flame had ended up in the Li Palace, the once sacred artifact of the demons, later on a treasure of the great Zhou, was now just an ordinary object for illumination. It was holy and blazing, but not dazzling. Moreover, its light, devoid of any warmth, shone on the Pope's elderly face, making him feel no discomfort. Chen Changsheng sat on the edge of the bed and finished reciting the scripture of longevity for the 9th time. He stood up and gazed at the white sun flame and the palace hall illuminated by it. The orthodoxy was the legacy left to him by the Pope, and the white sun flame was naturally a part of this legacy. The divine crown, the divine staff, the treasures of the 6 palaces, the array of the Li Palace, and millions of priests and believers still kneeling within, and without the Li Palace, unwilling to leave, were also part of this legacy. There was also power, but he remembered very clearly that there was still this legacy, but he didn't know where it had gone. The Pope had once clearly expressed his intentions. After his death, that item was to be safeguarded by Chen Changsheng. Where had the green leaf gone? 6 holy Qis formed a beautiful rainbow in the night sky. One end of the rainbow was in the Li Palace, piercing through the sea of stars and ultimately returning to the mortal world. Many places in the capital were illuminated and decorated by this rainbow. It was very difficult to tell which place had received more light and blessings. Everyone on the earth could see the vast sea of stars, but the starlight had never illuminated the world. At the bottom of the abandoned well, near the imperial city, near New North Bridge, there was no sunlight or starlight all year round. But today, there was miraculously a great deal of light. This light was a part of the rainbow from the Li Palace. The pitch-black, gloomy, and cold underground space that had existed for several centuries had not warmed, but at least it was no longer so terrifying. This was especially the case when the light illuminated the frost and snow on the ground, as well as the many things above the frost and snow. These things gave this place that was cut off from the mortal world the flavor of the mortal world. Stoves of different heights could be seen everywhere, looking like termite nests. There were also all sorts of kitchen utensils, pots, bowls, ladles, and basins. The especially hot Tuzhou charcoal was piled into a small mountain, and there were 10-some iron pots of various sizes and thicknesses. A specially made table the size of a lake was piled with countless dishes that a normal person could imagine. About 300 zhang across from this place was most likely a study. There are no walls and naturally no paintings or paintings hung there. There was only an incomparably long bookshelf with no end in sight. The shelves were piled high with books, and along the bookshelf there were all sorts of furniture arranged in order. Study tables, chairs, imperial concubines, and even further away there was an especially large bed there, not much smaller than the lake in the Orthodox Academy. This bed was especially magnificent, the carvings extremely luxuriant. 36 layers of bedding covered the bed, and the railing of the bed was inlaid with 72 night pearls. Just by looking at it, one could imagine how comfortable it would be to lie on it. The black-clothed dragon girl called Gigi, also known as Zhu Shao or Hong Zhuang, was currently lying on the bed, but it was obvious that she did not feel very comfortable. It was not because there was an unremarkable pea at the very bottom of the 36 bedding, nor was it because the last blue lobster Qin Changsheng had sent over was not fresh enough. It was because she was very nervous. The rainbow from the Li Palace illuminated the underground cavern, and also illuminated the wall over 10 li away that she did not want to face. She was the noblest and most powerful black frost dragon in the world. She could see a silver leaf thousands of li away, so naturally, she could also clearly see that the wall was currently undergoing a change. On the stone wall covered in frost and snow, a clump of green leaves had sprouted. I have to go to Shanghai for a meeting tomorrow. I will try my best to finish writing the update before leaving. I have something to report to everyone. The electronic contract for Heaven's Chosen is signed in the world of creation, and Qijian is currently distributing the book at the same time. You can read it wherever you want. I am very grateful. I can only receive rewards from the world of creation. I'm not saying that if you want a reward at Qijian, then move it to the world of creation. That would be too troublesome. But I have to report this to you. And actually, from the first day of this system, my attitude has always been like this. I will definitely urge everyone to subscribe. I feel that this is the way we should interact. As for rewards, I really don't need it at all. As long as you subscribe to the original version, that will be fine. If you are interested and have the time, write a review or vote. That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Chapter 729. The stone wall was engraved with the images of Qin Zhong and Yu Gong, two divine generals of the previous generation. The hands of the images were holding onto two chains that bound her feet. This was an array that Wang Jitsa had laid down back then. For the past several hundred years, no one, not even the little black dragon herself, had been able to pull out these two chains from the wall. Even if Chun Chongqing had used the cannon of flowing west and his own blood, he could only hope that it would be possible in 2 years. Logically speaking, a stone wall with such a powerful array should have cut off all external life, making it impossible for any plant to grow. But now a clump of green leaves had grown. This clump of green leaves only had 3 leaves. They had originally been very plump and tender, but now they seemed rather thin and weak, as if they had consumed a great deal of energy. Perhaps it was because the roots of this clump of green leaves were too developed? Countless roots, so thin that they were almost invisible to the naked eye, grew out from the bottom of the clump of green leaves and began to spread along the images on the stone wall. Some of them found the tiniest crack, penetrated deep into the stone wall, and then, under the illumination of the rainbow, began to madly grow. The rainbow and the clump of green leaves from the Li Palace were currently attempting to break this array. The little black dragon did not know what was going on or why, so she was very perplexed and then nervous. Her small face was pale, and the cinnabar birthmark between her eyebrows became even more striking. What illuminated the world was not starlight, but a rainbow. When these rainbows came together, they were colorless. Silently and unnoticed, they shone on New North Bridge, and they shone on the Frost Flower Shop. The Frost Flower Shop had a seemingly unremarkable, but actually heavily guarded garden called the Orange Garden. It was MOU's former residence, and also the prison where she was now placed under house arrest. Under the illumination of the colorless and formless rainbow, the array in the Orange Garden was like a thin layer of snow under the blazing sun, quietly melting. It did not alarm anyone or the frogs hibernating in the snow. Several small lanterns made from orange peels were hung over the window. They were very cute, and when the light seeped out, it was red, warmer than reality. MOU knelt on the prayer mat, facing the Li Palace. Her eyes were closed, her long eyelashes blinking. She felt incomparably warm. This was the Pope's final redemption for her. Perhaps it had something to do with her arranging for Chun Chongqing to enter the Orthodox Academy, or perhaps it had nothing to do with it, but it was all redemption. The rainbow vanished, and the treasures of the orthodoxy in the Grass Moon Hall and the other halls gradually calmed down. The chill at New North Bridge grew even colder, and the black hole in the snow seemed like it was about to crack open from the cold. The orange trees in Frost Flower Shop were covered with fresh frost. It was a rare and beautiful scene. The lamp in front of the window was still warm, and there was no one on the futon. The Pope's funeral was held very quickly, as everything had been prepared. The diplomatic missions from White Emperor City and the South did not leave the capital after the celebration because they were all mentally prepared. It was precisely because they were prepared that although the people of the world were sad, they were not too shocked, and there were not too many emotions of fear and unease. From autumn to winter, the great Zhou had lost 2 saints in succession, and the storms of the 8 directions had suffered even more grievous casualties. if one also included Su Li and the Holy Maiden of the South, who had left early. In just a few short years, the number of peak-level experts of the human race had plummeted. But in the eyes of the common people, the demons had suffered even greater losses from their internal strife. So how could they have the courage to invade the South? There were people who did not think this way, such as the Pope who had already returned to the Sea of Stars. Besides them, those who knew the inside story also grew more and more nervous as time passed. The Li Palace had already issued a public announcement, so the entire world knew that Qin Changxing was the Orthodoxy's new pope, even though he had still not formally succeeded the throne. To the shock and confusion of the people, no one saw his figure at the pope's funeral. This was a very difficult matter to imagine, but both the Li Palace and the imperial court maintained their silence. There seemed to be some sort of tacit understanding between the two. What was this tacit understanding? Was it the agreement that the Pope and Shang Xingzhou had reached after a long conversation on the night that Wang Pa and Chen Chongsheng killed Zhou Tong? Or were both sides waiting for that moment to come? The new year was approaching. A page was torn off the yellow paper, and the winter sun rose once more. Many things would change. On that day, the great Zhou dynasty would formally change its name, and the young emperor's position would become unshakable. The Li Palace would hold a grand ceremony of succession, and the orthodoxy would welcome a new master. The young emperor and the young pope were martial brothers. Such a thing had never happened before in history. This also meant that the current emperor and pope would both be Shang Xingzhou's students. This was also something that had never happened before in history. From every angle, this was the pinnacle of life that the people of the world could imagine. It was even unimaginable before it actually happened. He had led the entire world in overthrowing the Tianhai divine empress's rule, predicted that he might even have participated in the demon lord's destruction, subdued the pavilion of heavenly secrets with a wave of his hand, and added to the fact that the two disciples he had personally taught would become the two people with the greatest authority in the secular world and in the divine world. Even if Shang Xingzhou was not a god, he was still a legend. Regretfully, there is no such thing as true perfection in the world. The fate above the starry sky would not permit such a thing to happen. In the end, this problem still had to be resolved. No matter how incomprehensible people were, why Chen Changsheng wanted to oppose his teacher, no matter how incomprehensible they were, why Shang Xingzhou disliked, even loathed, this disciple that was in fact very popular. In short, this problem had to be resolved. This was no longer a problem between master and disciple. It was now related to the fate of the entire human race and even the entire world. Just what would happen on the day of the new year? The great Zhou dynasty's first internal war? The snowstorm continued to fall. The Grass Moon Hall, the Pure Kasha Palace, and the Institute of Moss were all dyed white. A lonely trail of footprints could be seen on the snow. The streets outside the Li Palace were deserted, but an invisible energy constantly rippled between those famous stone pillars. Whether it was the priests, the officials of the various halls, the teachers and students of the 6 Ivies, or the 20,000-some orthodoxy cavalry, no one went out. The imperial court maintained the highest level of vigilance in the various military camps of the capital. Several divine generals had even led the world's famed black-armored, heavy cavalry back south from the snowy plains of the north and stationed themselves on the front line of Black Valley. If one were to calculate the distance, this terrifying flood of armored cavalry had actually left the Northern Army office 20 days ago, and at that time the Pope was still alive. The mood in the capital was abnormally tense. On the last evening before the arrival of the new year, the snowstorm was still falling, so much so that it could even be called violent. This year, the capital was exceptionally cold. No one knew that a large part of the reason was that abandoned well not far from the imperial city. With great difficulty, the afterglow of the setting sun pierced through the clouds and snowflakes, landing on the palace walls and sprinkling down an extremely faint twilight. Suddenly, an unimaginably cold qi spread out from that abandoned well. Whether it was the withered leaves or the earth, Everything was instantly frozen solid. Even the ice and snow seemed to be frozen once more in some inexplicable way, and even the twilight seemed to be frozen solid. An extremely crisp sound came from the bottom of the well to the surface. It was already very weak, not even as clear as the sobbing that had followed it. It was the crying of a little girl. She had been crying all this time, but the emotions she conveyed were different from time to time. Sometimes it was especially happy and excited. Sometimes it was especially sad and sad. The soldiers on the imperial city and the commoners in their residences all heard the girl's cries, but they did not know where they had come from. They could not find her no matter where they searched. And they were even more confused as to how a little girl could stay outside in such cold weather. How could she be alive, and how could she constantly cry? She cried from dusk all the way into the night without stopping. After that day, besides the legend of the evil dragon, a new legend appeared in the area around New North Bridge. The protagonist of this new legend was a child bride who had been killed by her heartless mother-in-law. Chapter 730. As the night deepened, the chill grew even heavier. The ice and snow by the well had already been frozen like solid stone. A small hand appeared on the edge of the well, under the illumination of the lanterns of the imperial city. It was very white and clean, even whiter than the ice and snow in the sky, and also seemed even colder. As the small hand exerted force, the ice and snow rustled and shattered. A girl climbed out of the well. This scene was truly very much like a horror story. The girl stood in the snow, her breath turning into a mist of ice crystals as it met the air. It was not because her chi was hot, but because it was too cold. She wore a black dress, somewhat tattered and very old-fashioned. In this world of white, it was extremely striking. After several hundred years, Gigi had finally left that sinister and, to her, particularly cramped underground world, arriving in the real human world. The current human world had long ago forgotten that particularly brutal black frost dragon from the legends. She was also filled with a sense of unfamiliarity towards the current human world. Her soul had once been forcefully extracted from her dragon body by the Tianhai Divine Empress and entered the black jade Rui to accompany Qin Changxing on a trip to the Garden of Zhou. In that period of time, she had seen the streets of the capital, the green trees by the lake, the prosperity of Winshui, and that valley in the twilight, but everything before her eyes was still unfamiliar to her. At this moment, she was no longer a strand of soul, but real and complete. Her bare feet could clearly feel the soft touch and warmth of the snow. The tips of her hair could clearly feel the gentle and comfortable feeling brought by the winter wind. She could use her eyes, not her mind, to see the true wind and snow. She could even see the true starry sky behind the clouds of snow. Ah, the many stars that had not been seen for several hundred years. So you are still in the same position, scattering down the same beautiful silver radiance. Will my home in the southern islands still be the same? The sense of strangeness and reality constantly tangled and clashed in her mind, finally transforming into the truest fear. She had no idea that in the near future she would become a new legend in the human world. Although as a noble and powerful dragon, her existence was itself a legend to the human race, she was only afraid of this strange world. This world was a human world filled with humans, and humans were what she feared the most, whether noble or lowly, strong or weak. When life was at its weakest, most confused, and most afraid, it would always habitually want to find the most familiar support. That support could be a tree, a rock, a window, or even a person. Before Zhou Tong died, his consciousness was already in a daze. All he knew was to crawl towards the alley of the Northern Military Department. In her mind, there was only one person's name, and that was Qin Changsheng. Qin Changsheng was the person she was most familiar with in this world, and also the person she trusted the most. Due to some secret reasons, she firmly believed that he was responsible for her. Therefore, after she came back to her senses, she walked towards the Tradition Academy without hesitation. Her bare feet left a clear mark on the snow. The Tradition Academy and the neighboring herb garden were all heavily guarded. The Orthodoxy cavalry and the soldiers of the imperial court blocked off the entire street, silently confronting each other according to their respective camps. The atmosphere was abnormally tense, and no one knew what would happen next. The situation in the capital was constantly changing. With the Pope's return to the Sea of Stars, no one knew which way the hearts of the people would lean. But the people's judgment was slowly leaning towards the imperial court. The teachers and students of the Orthodox Academy were constantly leaving, and the number of people left was less than a third of the original number. The 18 girls of South Stream Temple and Sumayu naturally remained, but they were keenly aware that they were no longer able to influence what would happen next. The two people that could truly decide the outcome were currently under the great banyan tree by the lake. Tonight, the capital was sleepless because many people knew that this master and disciple were currently in the midst of their final negotiations. The snowstorm of the last few days had been very heavy. Just like the rest of the capital, the Orthodox Academy was covered in a thick layer of snow. The withered grass by the lake was completely covered up, and only the tips of the withered grass could be seen in the slightly bulging areas, giving off a particularly stubborn feeling. The leaves of the great banyan tree had fallen long ago, but its bare branches were still sturdy enough to bear the weight of quite a few people standing on them. Chun Chongxing was not on the tree, but standing under the tree in the snow. This was because his teacher was also standing in the snow. This was the first time this master and disciple had met since that morning in the Mausoleum of Books. On that day, they had brushed past each other on the Divine Avenue like strangers, their gazes not shifting. Today, however, they truly looked at each other. One could clearly see that the current Chun Chongsheng had changed from when he was in Xining Village. Chun Chongsheng was already the Pope, but he did not wear the divine robe, the divine crown, or the divine staff. Instead, he wore the uniform of the Orthodox Academy. His black hair had been meticulously combed and then tied into the simplest Taoist bun. What passed through his black hair to hold the bun in place was not some precious ebony fork, but an ordinary wooden chopstick. Shang Xingzhou's black hair, devoid of the color of frost, was similarly meticulously combed. His face was brimming with nobility and steadiness, indescribably free and at ease. However, his clothes were also very simple, just a blue Taoist robe. It was like he was not truly the number one person in the world, but just an ordinary Taoist priest. If someone were to see this scene, they would probably feel that this master and disciple, from a certain perspective, were very similar. This similarity did not just lie in their outer appearances, but also in the extremely deep indifference between their brows and the sense of alienation concealed beneath their calm exterior. Chun Chongxing prepared to speak, but he didn't know what to say. It had already been several years since he and that person standing across from him had spoken. To cultivators, several years was a very short period of time, but he had always felt it to be a very long time, so long that his memories of that old temple in Xining Village had become rather blurry. At the very least, there are some memories that were already difficult to recall. He could still clearly remember the mottled marks on the walls after the Taoist scriptures in the old temple had been moved away. He could still clearly remember that on the night before he left, his senior had cooked 4 plates of vegetables of different styles and tastes. One of the plates had been filled with a lot of garlic, but he had forgotten the contents of his final words to his master. At this moment, Shang Xingzhou spoke. "I picked you up from the stream. Although I knew beforehand that you would be in that stream, without me, you would have drowned in the stream or been eaten by that old dragon. In short, I saved your life, and it was I who raised you into a man, so your life is mine. Tonight was the last night. Tomorrow would be a new day just like the countless days that had passed, but it would be the first day of the new continent. This conversation in the snow would determine whether the people of the capital, and even the entire continent, would be able to peacefully and joyfully welcome the rising sun of the new year like they had in the past. No one had expected that this conversation would begin so suddenly and proceed so unyieldingly. so much so that the opening words sounded like the closing words. Chapter 731. Your life is mine. As he said this, Shang Xingzhou's expression was very calm. It was like he was speaking of the world's simplest and most unquestionable truth. Just like how the sun rose in the east and set in the west, the starry sky would never change, and eggs were best fried in vegetable oil. Upon hearing this, Chen Chongqing very naturally recalled the most famous scene from the internal strife of Mount Li that year. Ruler and subject, father and son, master and disciple. These were the three most difficult laws to break through in the world. At the time, the Qiushan clan head had said the words father and son, and even someone as extraordinary as Qiushan Jun had been forced to stab through his own chest in order to break through these two words. What should Qin Chongqing do? In truth, everyone knew that once the conflict between master and disciple completely exploded, Shang Xingzhou would assuredly use the bond of master and disciple to smash it down. Su Mayu, the teachers and students of the Orthodox Academy, and the priests of the Li Palace were all deeply concerned. But none of them could think of a good way to deal with it for Qin Chongqing. Qin Chongqing had naturally mentally prepared himself for this. He had imagined this scene many times, so he was not surprised. He did not speak, mostly because he was remembering, hearing his master's voice, thinking of Mount Li, looking at the winter trees by the lake, thinking of Tang 36's words. That was a matter from a very long time ago. At the time he and Tang 36 had stood on the great banyan tree, gazing at the capital under the setting sun, the nearby imperial palace and the distant Li Palace. Tang 36 had said many things related to vigilance, but they could also be understood as bad things about his master. Soon after, Qin Chongqing recalled that night when the Pope returned to the Sea of Stars. He had walked alone on the snowy ground of the Li Palace for a very long time. Before that, he had already told the Pope how he would understand and treat this relationship between master and disciple. He was not Qiushan Jun, and Shang Xingzhou was not the Qiushan clan head. There was no meaning in killing himself. He did not know that his senior brother Yuren had tried a similar method in the imperial palace, and even if he knew, he would not have tried it, because this method had to be established on a certain foundation. The Qiushan clan head loved Qiushan Jun, and Shang Xingzhou loved Yuren. Qin Chongqing very calmly confirmed a cruel fact. His master had never liked him. The moment he completely understood this matter, he obtained true freedom and peace. Then, just like he had said to the Pope, just like Tang 36 had taught him, speak. Thank you. Qin Chongqing looked at Shang Xingzhou and said, regardless of those disgusting and ugly plots and the shameless harm to the baby, you saved me in the stream and raised me. So thank you. Then there was no then. He looked calmly at the opposite side of the snowy ground. His eyes were bright, and he did not say another word. After a long period of silence, Shang Xingzhou narrowed his eyes and said slowly, that's it. Qin Chongqing thought for a while and asked, you want to get back your living expenses from these years? How much is the total? When he spoke, his expression was very serious. It didn't seem like he was joking at all, because this matter was not something that could be joked about. Even if I admit that you saved my life, I have already thanked you. What else do you want? Living expenses? Tell me, I'll give it all back to you. I'm already rich, and I have a very rich friend. Back then, on the big banyan tree, when Tang 36 said these words, his eyebrows were raised as if they were about to burn in the twilight. He was very proud. Qin Chongqing recalled the scene at that time and couldn't help but smile. Shang Xingzhou also began to laugh. His laughter was very clear and bright, completely at odds with his age and experience. It was completely different from the silent and unremarkable middle-aged Taoist in Qin Chongqing's memories. The snow on the big banyan tree rustled down. The laughter suddenly stopped. In the entire world, only you and I, master and disciple, know why I cannot let you stay in the capital. Shang Xingzhou coldly said to Qin Chongqing, because you are His Majesty's only weakness or loophole. Many people did not understand why Shang Xingzhou's attitude towards Qin Changsheng was so unyielding. This was because they did not know of the relationship between Yuan and Qin Changsheng. A few days ago, when the snow was swirling, the young emperor had stood in the snow, blocking Shang Xingzhou's path. The jade, pendant the Qiushan clan had offered as tribute, gently swayed. His resolve had temporarily preserved Qin Changsheng's life, but it had also deepened Shang Xingzhou's apprehension. In the future, if someone were to use Qin Changsheng to threaten Yuan, what would happen? Of course, Qin Changsheng was already the Pope of the Orthodoxy. Logically speaking, no one could use him. But if Qin Changsheng himself had other ideas, given the authority of the Pope and Yuan's affection for him, what would the result be? Qin Changsheng understood, but he did not accept it. He solemnly said to Shang Xingzhou, "Master, you should be well aware that I am not this sort of person." Shang Xingzhou's expression did not change. People change. He had lived in this world for 1,000 years. He had seen far too many changes in scenery, the transformation of the sea into mulberry fields, and had seen far too many changes in people's hearts. He was keenly aware that as one's status and authority changed, even if it was often just because of a change in seat, once loyal and devoted subordinates would turn traitor. Once comrades who had gone through life and death with each other would turn against each other. In the history of the great Zhou dynasty, incidents like brothers falling out with each other were common occurrences. Qin Changsheng had never seen those storms of the past. He was still a young man like the new wind of spring. Even though he had already seen many things of decay and darkness, he solemnly said to Shang Xingzhou, "I will not become that sort of person." Shang Xingzhou replied, "I don't believe you." Qin Changsheng asked, "Then does that mean that Master will not covet the throne?" Shang Xingzhou replied, "I won't, because that would go against the original intent of my Tao heart." Qin Changsheng asked, "Master, you believe that you can follow your heart, that you will not covet the glory and power of the world. So why don't you believe me?" Shang Xingzhou replied, "Because I am keenly aware of where my heart lies, and you are still too young. You simply do not know where your heart lies. So how can you maintain it?" Qin Changsheng now naturally knew that his master's lifelong pursuit was to complete Emperor Taizong's dying wish, to exterminate the demons, to seek a truly bright future for the human race, to establish a foundation for the great Zhou that would never change. For this, he would not hesitate to pay any price. Those portraits in the Lingyan Pavilion, those legendary ministers depicted in those portraits, just how many of them had died at Taoist Ji's hand? In order to overthrow the Tianhai divine empress's rule, just how many people had died in this world, and just how many more would die? Shang Xingzhou firmly believed that what he had done was correct, firmly believed that he was correct. He felt no guilt, much less any pressure. His Tao heart had always been clear, light as a feather, able to turn as he wished, ascending the blue sky to swim the seven seas, also like a boulder. Even if a flood soared to the heavens, what could it do? Qin Changsheng also cultivated the Tao of following one's heart, so he naturally understood. Because they understood, they would not be compassionate. They would only develop a sharp spirit. He could clearly see the only flaw in Shang Xingzhou's Tao. Xining Village's old temple had taught him much, and Shang Xingzhou had also taught him much. You don't like me because I am Senior's only flaw, but there is an even more important reason. Qin Changsheng looked into his master's eyes and said, "You are afraid to see me." Chapter 732. On that day when eunuch Lin had received the decree to enter the Orthodox Academy, Qin Changsheng had said something similar. Shang Xingzhou had been in the Li Palace at the time, conversing with the Pope. His reaction to this was very similar. Truly childish. Qin Changsheng's face still had a hint of childishness, but anyone could see the firmness within. He knew that his view was correct. The Tianhai Divine Empress was dead. The Pope had returned to the Sea of Stars, the demon lord had fallen into the abyss, and Wang Jitsa had secluded himself from the world. There were very few people in the world that could contend against Shang Xingzhou. His Tao heart was brightly lit, his Tao unhindered, and his cultivation unfathomable. He ruled over the great Zhou dynasty and possessed the friendship of White Emperor City. He seemed invulnerable, almost perfect, but he still had a flaw. This flaw was none other than his youngest disciple, Qin Chongqing, whom he had always disliked. Beside Xining Village's old temple was a small stream. Flowers drifted along the stream. The temple hid 3,000 Taoist scriptures, but master and disciple only cultivated one, following one's heart. Following one's heart was an extremely powerful divine ability of the Taoist faith. Only by standing under the starry sky, with a clear conscience and no regrets, could one be fearless, their Tao heart brightly lit, their Tao unhindered. In his tensome years in Xining Village's old temple, Shang Xingzhou had never taught Yiren or Qin Chongqing any Taoist techniques, only had them recite the Taoist scriptures. But once they began to interact with specific cultivation methods, they would advance at an astonishing speed. Qin Chongqing's breakthrough into star condensation in 3 years and Yiren's ability to freely walk among the heavenly tome monoliths were both because of this. Correspondingly, this Taoist technique had an extremely high demand on the mind. It was like a snow lotus at the summit of a mountain that could not be contaminated by the slightest dirt. How could one not be confused by external objects? How could one possess an unshakable will and self-confidence? One word to remember: the heart. You only needed to be able to convince yourself. If you could convince yourself that what you were doing was right, that it was in accordance with your heart, then it would naturally follow your heart. This sounded very simple, but it was actually not. If one looked into the depths of the soul, if one were in a hidden room cut off from the world, how many people could truly say no regrets? Who can firmly believe that everything he does is right? Several hundred years ago, Shang Xingzhou was still one of the legitimate successors of the orthodoxy. He originally could have followed the predetermined path until he became the Pope, but he chose a different path. He used the name of Taoist Ji to live in this world, and when Taoist Wu painted one portrait after another in the Lingyan Pavilion, he was responsible for returning the people in those portraits to the Sea of Stars. The people in those portraits were all heroes of the human race, all meritorious subjects of the great Zhou, but they had died just like that in a conspiracy. Some of them, like Qin Zhong and divine General Yugong, were willing to die, but what about the other dukes? The heroic spirits in the Lingyan Pavilion had been watching Shang Xingzhou this entire time. Perhaps the resentful souls that had died even earlier in the 100 Herb Garden were also watching Shang Xingzhou. The innocent people who died in the chaos today would surely be looking at him. But these things still could not affect Shang Xingzhou's Tao heart, because he had many reasons to convince himself. He looked down on those so-called ambitious and ruthless people, and loathed schemers like Black Robe who did not dare to see the light of day the most. He viewed himself as Emperor Taizong's successor, and with the world in his heart he could naturally disregard the trifles. For the continued existence of the great Zhou dynasty for 10,000 years, for the bright future of the human race, this was an inevitable price. But there was one thing that Shang Xingzhou still had not found a suitable way to convince himself: Qin Chongqing. Yes, the wooden basin floating in the stream, the infant in the basin, the drooping whiskers of the golden dragon. All of it was a conspiracy. But the Qin Chongqing he first saw was not the Duke of Wei, not Wang Jitsa, not Tianhai, not a general of great authority, not a tycoon whose wealth was unparalleled in the world, not a noble consort with long sleeves and dancing, not a repulsive eunuch, not an impassioned scholar whose eloquence would harm the country, not an experienced and prudent minister who cherished his reputation. It was just an infant that could not even open its eyes, an infant that was ignorant and senseless, an infant that had no good, no evil, and no thoughts. He could not find any reason to convince himself that this was the right thing to do. In these 14 years, every time he saw Qin Changxing, a question would arise in his mind, a shadow cast over his Tao heart. Life in Xining Village's old temple was very simple, and not seeing each other was countless times more difficult than meeting. Qin Changxing had gone from an infant to a youth like the spring breeze. The shadow over Shang Xingzhou's Tao heart was already as thick as the night. I know that teacher does not feel any guilt towards me. This matter has nothing to do with good or evil. It is just that you are unable to convince yourself, and convincing yourself will always be the most important thing. Qin Changxing looked at Shang Xingzhou and said, "So my existence is a very frightening thing to you." Before the Buddhist sect was destroyed, there was a saying about the heart barrier. He was currently Shang Xingzhou's heart barrier. Shang Xingzhou wanted to do everything he could to get rid of this heart barrier. Only by doing so could he truly maintain the brightness of his Tao heart. He wished for Qin Changxing to die, but he could not personally do it, as that would have no effect. It would only make the heart barrier grow deeper and deeper, and there would be no chance to get rid of it. Several days ago, even if Yurin had not used such a decisive method to keep him in the Snow Palace, he would not have gone to the alley of the Northern Military Department, but to the Li Palace. Back on the divine path of the Mausoleum of Books, when he walked down the divine path, he did not even glance at Qin Changxing, nor did he stop Qin Changxing from taking away the Tianhai Divine Empress's remains. He had already thought through his future plans. He wanted to use these matters as an excuse to very naturally have Qin Changxing die at the hands of others. There were quite a few times when he was already very close to success. For instance, Eunuch Lin wanted to sweep away the threats and obstacles to the young emperor's rule. He wanted to use the matter of the Tianhai Divine Empress's remains to cause trouble and privately attempt to kill Qin Changxing, but he did not succeed. Or perhaps he wanted to use Xue Xingchuan's encounter to use Zhou Tong as a bait to have Qin Changxing strike first, and then kill him. Alas, none of them succeeded. Qin Changxing said, "I did not expect that you had already seen through all this, but it doesn't matter." Shang Xingzhou's expression was somewhat regretful. If not for Wang Pa, you would have already died to Taishu that day. When Eunuch Lin suddenly attacked in the Orthodox Academy, Qin Changxing had already understood everything, but now that he saw his master's regret, he still felt rather sad. Shang Xingzhou looked at him and continued, "I swore to your martial uncle that I would not act against you, and this is the truth. Whether it's Lin or Zhou, neither of them were deliberately arranged by me. Everything happened naturally. If you had insisted on staying in the capital, these sorts of things would have happened more and more, and they would not have been affected by my intentions." It was difficult to determine whether these words were true or false, but there was no need to determine whether they were true or false. A person's intentions would always fluctuate between what was true and what was false. Even if one could see through the color and fragrance of flowers, one would still find it impossible to see through these things. On the wall across from the lake, 10 some blue-clothed Taoists appeared. These blue-clothed Taoists possessed unfathomable cultivations, and as their sleeves fluttered in the wind, they faintly exuded killing intent. Successful completion of the Genesis update. Right now, I'm just worried about whether or not it will synchronize to the starting point. If this is the case, there will be duplicate chapters. Tomorrow, during the day, I will ask the technical staff of the website to help me deal with this. If there really is a duplicate subscription, I will think of a way to make it up to everyone. Chapter 733. Is it really going to be like this? Qin Changxing's gaze fell across the lake. The existence of these blue-clothed Taoists was no longer a secret. Many people knew that they came from the eastern capital, Luoyang, from a small and nameless Taoist monastery. "I said before I've made no arrangements," Shang Xingzhou said. The height of the sun determined the angle at which many plants grew. An important figure, like Shang Xingzhou, did not need to do anything or make any arrangements for many people to naturally be willing to kill Qin Changxing for him. because he had already expressed his stance through many matters. Qin Changxing drew back his gaze and looked at Shang Xingzhou. Even if this is a war. In accordance with the Pope's final decree, he had come to the Orthodox Academy to carry out this important negotiation with Shang Xingzhou. So he had naturally made arrangements. The Li Palace was already on standby, the Orthodoxy cavalry ready to charge at any time. When the blue-clothed Taoists arrived by the lake, Mao Chuyu and the others were probably already there. Most importantly, he was now the Pope. If Shang Xingzhou still insisted on killing him, he would assuredly incite a war that would destroy the entire capital. Many people in the Li Palace will support me, Shang Xingzhou calmly said. As the sole saint of the great Zhou dynasty, the teacher of the emperor and the Pope, Shang Xingzhou's prestige had already reached an absurd level, and he was a legitimate successor of the orthodoxy. From every angle, he had the right to enter the Li Palace, let alone the ordinary priests of the Li Palace, even the cardinals, and even some of the 5 prefects would be willing to accept his descent. It was only because the Pope's final decree and subsequent measures were extremely unyielding, and the great announcement had been announced to the world that the orthodoxy could maintain its unity and unity. If Shang Xingzhou really took the risk, even if he could not personally act, he still had enough strength to forcefully kill Qin Changxing in the Orthodox Academy, as long as he moved fast enough and made a small enough disturbance. Just what would happen next? The snowstorm enveloped the capital, also enveloped the Orthodox Academy. Together with the snowstorm was a dense mass of soldiers whose numbers were difficult to discern. A girl walked out from the other end of the snowstorm. The little girl was dressed in black. Her head was slightly lowered, and her slightly wide collar turned into a black curtained hat that covered her face. Miraculously, she walked along the street all the way to the entrance of 100 Blossom Lane, but none of the cavalrymen noticed her. Only when she got close did the experts of the imperial court and the priests of the Li Palace at the mouth of the alley see the footprints in the snow and discover her existence. "Halt!" someone shouted. It was unknown whether it was a general of the court or a cardinal. It was very likely that something big would happen tonight. The capital sank into an incomparably tense atmosphere. At this moment, a young girl suddenly walked out of the wind and snow. Anyone would find it strange. Hearing this voice, the black-clothed girl's body trembled. She lowered her head and continued to walk deeper into the alley. Her footsteps became even more hurried, as if she was afraid. Of course, such a reaction could also be interpreted as arrogance, courting death. A sinister voice rang out from the shadows in the alley. The buildings in 100 Flowers Lane had been completely flattened by the cavalry of the imperial court in the previous few days. Only that tea-house, which had some commemorative value, was left standing. Just as the black-clothed girl walked past that ruined building, an even more sinister and venomous sword glow pierced out of the shadows along with that sinister voice. This sword glow was abnormally bright. Mixed in with the wind and snow, it was unremarkable, and the sword energy was terrifying to the extreme. Even more frightening was that as this sword glow brightened, the shadows at the mouth of the alley began to faintly emit stardust. The first to strike was a star condensation assassin, probably from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets. Experts that had just been subdued by the imperial court always wanted to prove their worth as quickly as possible. A few days ago, they had encircled Qin Changxing in the alley of the Northern Military Department, but it had ultimately turned into a chaotic and inconclusive battle. Tonight, they did not want to miss another chance. No one could have predicted what would happen next. Whether it was the assassins in the alley, the experts of the military, the guardians of the princely estates, or the Li Palace priests and experts of the various academies at the end of the alley. When the sinister sword glow arrived, the girl still had her head lowered, her face hidden in her curtained hat. She did not react at all. Yet, just like that, the sword glow shattered, transforming into countless fragments that dissipated into the night sky, truly mixing in with the wind and snow. The shattering here was truly shattering. The assassin's sword had directly shattered, causing those sword glows to shatter with it. There were not many people in the world that could deal with a star condensation assassin, and to be able to shatter the sword of a star condensation assassin. Many people had never seen such a person. This was not the true conclusion, because after the sword glow shattered, another object shattered. The assassin had shattered. There was only a light hum. The snow in 100 Flowers Lane suddenly turned pink, as if someone had poured several large buckets of paint into it. Soon after, several dozen chunks of flesh fell to the ground like a torrential rain. Only upon careful inspection could one clearly see that they were human limbs and organs. Blood sprayed and severed limbs fell. All of this happened in an extremely brief instant. Only then did the crowd clearly see what was happening. The black-clothed girl still had her head lowered, her face hidden in the shadow of the curtained hat, but she had extended a hand forward. This hand was very small, very white like a snow lotus, but at this moment it was dripping with blood. It was exceptionally clear and ghastly to the eye. The place where her small hand had appeared was a snowstorm. It had previously been the position of the star condensation assassin. The dark alley was deathly still. After a moment, several howls of panic and anger rose up. An assassin from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets and 2 experts from the army transformed into 3 streams of snow and wind to attack. There were 3 soft popping sounds, like 3 ripe grapes, or like 3 cracks on the surface of ice. The 3 streams of snow and wind suddenly shattered. The 3 experts of the imperial court once more became 3 showers of blood and flesh. No one could clearly see what the black-clothed girl had done, because, in reality, she had not done anything at all. She had only extended her hand into the snow and wind. The snow and wind would obey her will and obliterate all existences within it. Then she finally raised her head. The black curtained hat fell, her black hair falling down like a waterfall, revealing the face of a young girl. Her face was incomparably white, as if it had never seen the sun in its entire life. Her face was elegant and beautiful, but it possessed a biting cold chi. What was most striking was her eyes. They were vertical pupils. They seemed abnormally strange. At this moment, the emotions in her eyes were extremely complex. There was some reminiscence, some unease, some fear, and also some madness. This gaze, coupled with the blood on her snow-white face, made her seem incomparably terrifying. Suddenly, she stuck out her tongue and licked a strand of blood from the corner of her lips. At this sight, the experts hidden in the darkness and snow felt a fear that came from the deepest depths of their souls. Yesterday's upload truly did make a mistake, causing a few friends to subscribe to the previous chapter. I hereby solemnly apologize. This has nothing to do with the website. My hands were itching. In a few days, I will think of a way to make it up to you. In addition, today, I have an important matter that requires everyone's help. Today, the little black dragon has finally come out of the well and appeared on the screen. In the second half of this chapter, she will play a very important role, but even now, I have been unable to decide just which name to call her. Gigi, Zhu Sha, Hong Zhuang, or Her Highness the Princess. In a little while, I will post a poll on the official WeChat account, Mountie1118. I will trouble everyone to choose. I love you all. Okay, I have posted this chapter many times. Chapter 734. These experts had either come from the military, the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets, or the Department for Purging Officials. They had experienced countless life-and-death battles and seen countless bitter scenes. Logically speaking, no matter how terrifying a scene was, it should not have been enough to make their hearts tremble. But the black-clothed girl had only licked the blood from the corner of her lips to make them feel incomparable fear. Some of the weak-willed people even began to tremble. This was because this fear had already surpassed the limits of experience and reason. It came from the depths of their souls, a mark that seemed to have been branded into the starry sky countless years before they were born. The black-clothed girl stood in the snow, her feet bare, a chain hanging from her ankles. She looked just like a prisoner, and it was very easy to feel pity for her. But at this moment, no one in the alley was paying attention to these details. They had already been frozen into blocks of ice by the power she had displayed and the look in her eyes. In those glass-like eyes, whether it was madness or unease, reminiscence or fear, all became apathetic in the face of the rain of blood and flesh. It was even an apathy to death. This was too frightening. Just who was she? Many people had already noticed that the black-clothed girl had a pair of bewitching vertical pupils. Could she be a great demon hidden from the world? Then what did she have to do with White Emperor City? Some people subconsciously turned to a certain snowstorm in the middle of 100 Flowers Lane. The supreme expert of the demi-human's middle generation, Xiaoda, was currently there. When they saw Xiaoda, they were shocked once more. Xiaoda was currently in a very strange state. It was like he was suffering from a serious illness. His face was pale, and even in the cold of winter, he was constantly sweating. Countless wisps of hot steam rose from his hair and robe into the night sky, but they still could not conceal the fear and alarm in his eyes. As a great general of the demi-human race and an expert of the proclamation of liberation, Xiaoda was naturally confident. Even when facing Wang Pa, who he had never been able to defeat and who made others despair, he would not be so afraid. Only when he encountered the middle-aged scholar demon, lured by the stream in Mount Han, did he have a similar reaction. The crowd was stunned by this sight, once more calling out that question in their minds. Just who was she? Everyone looked in fear and unease at the black-clothed girl at the mouth of the alley. At this moment, another accident occurred. The black-clothed girl suddenly bent down and began to vomit. She constantly vomited, as if only by vomiting out everything in her body would she feel better. After some time, she seemed to feel better and straighten her body. But when she saw the mess on the snow-covered ground, her snow-white face flushed with embarrassment and anger. She began to stomp her feet and complain incessantly. Her black hair danced wildly, and she looked like a little girl who had been agitated or wronged. She was very angry. The snow-white bare feet kept stepping on the snowy ground, and the chains kept rattling. Boom, 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 boom. There seemed to be thunder exploding at the entrance of the alley. The snowy ground trembled, and the heaven and earth became restless. The cold air was squeezed with all its might, and then it escaped into the distance. An unimaginably powerful aura appeared, tearing everything in its path as it followed her movements. Regardless of whether it was the softest snow or the hardest stone, regardless of whether it was the formation that had just been set up the night before or the old wall that had been built for 300 years in the south of 100 Flowers Lane, under this terrifying aura, they all shattered into the tiniest pieces. The experts of the imperial court hidden in the darkness and snow did not dare to linger. They were all forced out, flying into the distance like arrows. For a moment, the outside of the Orthodox Academy was filled with sounds of air being torn apart and cries of fear. After some time, the black-clothed girl stopped stamping her feet. She lowered her head and stood where she was, her slightly swollen chest rising and falling. The snow at the entrance of the alley had completely vanished, and the filth that she had vomited on the snow had also disappeared. Only the ground remained. Some deep cracks had appeared on the ground, steam rising from them. Through this venting, she had somewhat calmed down, no longer as angry as before. However, as she glanced at the blood on her hands and body, anger once more appeared in her bewitching vertical pupils. This time, without waiting for her to do anything, the experts of the imperial court once more flew through the air, wanting nothing more than to fly out of the capital. Even the experts of the orthodoxy in the distance subconsciously retreated several dozen zhang. Fortunately, she did not once more fall into madness. She maintained her calm. She glanced at the filthy blood on her body. The filthy blood was frozen into frost by the extreme cold and then rustled to the ground. This scene seemed simple, But in the eyes of those star condensation cultivators in the darkness, it was like a miracle. Just how much and how pure star radiance true essence was needed to lower the temperature to this level in such a short time. Even if experts of the divine domain like the storms of the 8 directions could do this, who would waste so much star radiance true essence just to make themselves a little cleaner? The crowd was once more stunned at this sight, once more calling out that question in their minds. Just who was she? The black-clothed girl did not know what they were thinking, nor did she care. She did not care in the slightest. She walked into the alley, the chains around her ankles dragging on the ground, clanging and clanging, then transforming into a muffled boom. That tea house that had accompanied the Orthodox Academy in its rise and fall, that had watched many of the all-school martial exhibitions, had collapsed. The collapsed tea house had not stirred up a single speck of dust, as countless snowstorms held down from the sky. In the shortest amount of time, a thick layer had formed, completely covering the rubble and dust. She faced the snowstorm avoiding it. As the purest, noblest, and probably the only black frost dragon left in the world, the snowstorm had always been her subjects. After she crawled out of that abandoned well, she did not know where to go, so she had come to the Orthodox Academy. Of course, this was also because before the green leaf had pulled the chains out of the stone wall, she had made a promise to herself. Braving the snowstorm from New North Bridge, she had never felt cold. On the contrary, she felt her cheeks burn a little, because freedom truly felt good. Perhaps it was because she was about to see him as a free person. But when she was about to reach 100 Flowers Lane, she felt uneasy and fearful, because she sensed that many people were hiding in the darkness. These people could be considered experts of the human race, although they were not enough to threaten her. They were enough to pose some trouble. But her uneasiness and fear had nothing to do with this. She was just afraid of crowds. Many, many years ago, when she had come from the warm seas of the south to this strange continent in search of her father, she had been surrounded by many people. She did not like crowds of people that crowded around her like ants. It made her feel somewhat disgusted, somewhat uneasy. She felt that the explanation given by Qin Changsheng was very correct. This was called trypophobia. What she disliked even more was that whether she was flying in the sky or walking on the ground, there would always be so many people pointing at her, shouting something, crying something. She did not understand. She had done nothing, so why would these humans cry? Because they were weak and afraid? Then should she feel sorry for being strong? She thought so. The voting on the official WeChat account is far more intense than I imagined. I originally thought that Gigi would be far ahead, but I didn't think that the other 2 topics would also have so many supporters. It's nearing 10,000 votes, but the difference is still around 100 votes. It's also because of this that today's chapter can only continuously use she. Even the chapter's name is she, haha. Let's end it at midnight today. The name of the little black dragon will be decided by everyone. Chapter 735. On the 7th night after landing, she was ambushed by a treacherous silver dragon from behind the clouds and sustained significant injuries. In the following half a month, she was unable to transform into a dragon and could only walk on the ground. Since she had to interact with the humans, she could only endure. If those humans were only crying, cursing, pointing, she might have been able to endure. But when that scholar surnamed Zhou from the countryside rushed over with a red face and said that he wanted to rid her of the 4 pests she could no longer endure. As a noble black frost dragon, she loved cleanliness, so how could she allow that man reeking of alcohol to approach her? That day, she extended her hand just like tonight. Thus, that scholar surnamed Zhou died, transformed into a flower of blood. That flower of blood from several hundred years ago was even more beautiful than tonight's bloom. The scholar surnamed Zhou was even more thoroughly shattered, turning into powder that was blown away by the wind. Perhaps it was because she did not have these chains on her feet at the time. She thought to herself. In short, the scholar surnamed Zhou died. Later on, according to that wicked scholar surnamed Wang. He even appeared in the local county annals and became a hero praised by all the people. She expressed that she did not understand this, nor did she care. The people of that county later organized 10-some volunteer armies to kill her, but she ended up killing many of them. The people of that county were all very disorderly, so presumably the annals were also written randomly. She thought to herself, but too many people really was very vexing. She had an extremely poor memory of this. When she sensed the countless people surrounding the Orthodox Academy tonight, her first reaction was unease and then fear. She used a curtain hat to conceal her beautiful face and quickened her pace, wanting to enter the Orthodox Academy as quickly as possible. But she was still discovered by someone at the entrance of 100 Flowers Lane. The assassin from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets had sneaked out of the snowstorm and wanted to kill her. This assassin did not have much of a scent compared to that scholar surnamed Zhou from several hundred years ago. But as a noble black frost dragon, when offended, she naturally had to make a response befitting of her status. This response was even faster than her ability to think. It was to have the assassin die. The assassin from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets exploded into blood and flesh that fell to the snowy ground. She felt a lot more comfortable, and the fear she felt towards the crowd in the depths of her heart faded a lot. Accompanied by this, the ruthlessness in her heart gradually increased. Following that, she killed another 2 human powerhouses. As the blood splashed and death approached, all of her fear and uneasiness disappeared. Her violent emotions triggered her bloodthirsty instincts. She instinctively licked the blood at the corner of her lips. She thought it would be sweet and delicious, but who knew it would be so filthy and stinky? Was it because the yuan qi on the continent was thin that humans became much more unpalatable? Or could it be the food that Qin Changsheng sent over in the past few years was too rich, which made him picky? As she thought of this, she couldn't help but feel nauseous and vomit. This situation made her very angry, making her feel a lot of resentment towards the weak humans and Chen Changsheng, who might be harboring evil intentions. She began to lose her temper. Like a wrong child, she kept stamping her feet, scaring away the wind and snow, cracking the ground, and scaring the whole world. The wind and snow rose once more as she walked towards the Orthodox Academy. Her body was not very large. On the contrary, it was rather petite, but as she approached, the space in 100 Flowers Lane began to faintly deform as if it was about to burst. Blood seeped out of the darkness, perhaps from assassins who had not been able to escape in time or soldiers who had been knocked unconscious. The experts of the imperial court that had fled far away sensed that terrifying qi growing more and more real, that powerful pressure seemingly about to materialize. Xiaoda's complexion was even uglier, so pale that it was devoid of blood. His sensitivity to this aura was far greater than that of a human expert. This qi was clearly not completely mature, but it seemed to originate from the most primordial wilderness, imbued with an ancient and leisurely aura. To humans, this qi was powerful and terrifying, but to demi-humans, this qi directly crushed down on their souls, making it impossible for them to even think of resisting or have the courage to do so. Xiaoda's body incessantly trembled. Logically speaking, even if he was no match for this black-clothed girl, he should at least be able to slow her down a little. Yet no matter how he mobilized his true essence, strengthened his will, or even went berserk, he could not gather enough courage. He did not even dare to take a single step forward. This innate pressure between living beings was truly too terrifying. The fact that he could still remain in the lane, still stand, not kneel in the snow, was proof of his strength and pride. But this was still far from enough. The black-clothed girl noticed the existence of this demi-human and turned her head to glance at him, somewhat interested. Under her gaze, Xiaoda's soul seemed to be scorched by sacred flames. Fear surged out of his eyes, and he no longer dared to linger. He suddenly turned and vanished into the darkness. Not long after Xiaoda vanished, A leisurely sigh came from the darkness. A hint of wariness appeared on the black-clothed girl's face. Nothing happened. After that sigh, there was no other sound. On the Bridge of Helplessness, some 14 li from this place, the demi-human empress, Madame Mu, boarded a carriage pulled by a 7-colored deer and began to drive out of the capital. On the snowy shore of the Orthodox Academy, Shang Xingzhou turned to look in the direction of the Bridge of Helplessness. He slightly arched his brows in surprise. The departure of Madame Mu and the demi-human diplomatic mission meant that from this moment onwards, White Emperor City would maintain its neutrality between the great Zhou imperial court and the orthodoxy. Why had there been such a large change? It had to be known that this was highly likely to alter the situation of the entire continent. It was naturally because of that black-clothed girl who had arrived against the wind and snow. Unlike the proud and aloof heavenly phoenix, the dragon race had written far too many stories on the continent. To the demi-humans, the dragon race, which had not appeared in the world for a very long time, was still their deeply rooted belief, their spiritual sustenance. Moreover, it was said that the demi-humans on the 2 shores of the Red River had a very close relationship with the black frost dragons that allowed them to establish their country. The walls of the Orthodox Academy were broken, and the black-clothed girl walked in. 10 some blue-clothed Taoists stood in the snow, forming a seemingly messy, but actually almost perfect formation. She could sense the strength of these humans, and then she saw the middle-aged Taoist on the other side of the lake. She had been imprisoned at the bottom of the well of New North Bridge for several centuries, but she had still seen many human experts, like Wang Jitze, Qin Zhong, the Tianhai Divine Empress, the Pope, and Su Li. But in reality, she was only afraid of Su Li and Tianhai, because these 2 truly did dare to kill her. Now, there was one more human that made her feel a faint fear. She was somewhat nervous, but she did not stop walking. She walked across the lake and came to Qin Changxing's side. She cleared her throat and said, "Hello, I am your protector." Chapter 736. Before speaking, she first cleared her throat. She appeared very calm, even playful like a child. But Shang Xingzhou and Qin Changxing could both hear the slight tremble in her voice. It was not because she was excited to meet Qin Changxing with her free body, but because she was uneasy. She felt that she was too close to the middle-aged Taoist, somewhat dangerous. At this moment, she still did not know that this person was Qin Changxing's master, but she could clearly sense that he had the ability to harm or even kill her. There were very few human experts in the world that had the ability to harm or even kill her. But tonight, just as she had escaped her imprisonment of several hundred years, she had encountered one. This made her feel a sense of defeat, as if she was facing her fate, so much so that she did not dare to glance at Shang Xingzhou. She only stared into Qin Changxing's eyes, seeming especially serious and focused. She had no idea that in Shang Xingzhou's eyes, she was also an extremely dangerous existence. The records of the humans in the Taoist canon clearly stated that one could never be too wary of the dragon race, the highest level of creatures under the starry sky. Moreover, she was a black frost dragon with the noblest and strongest bloodline of the dragon race. Her petite body was brimming with energy that countless human experts dreamed of but could never possess. If she learned to use that energy, or if that energy were to just passively explode, it would assuredly create a terrifying momentum and bitter consequences. She feared Shang Xingzhou, and Shang Xingzhou was wary of her. Qin Changxing was only very shocked. He had not expected that she had actually escaped from the bottom of the well. Even if he and Su Yorong had used the correct method, his blood, driven by the sublimation of the scripture of flowing west, was constantly being corroded by time. Based on his calculations, it would still take at least 2 years for the chain to snap. Moreover, after leaving the underground world, why had she not hurriedly left this continent brimming with the aura of humans that she disliked the most and returned to the warm archipelago in the south? Why had she come to the Orthodox Academy? There were many variables in this negotiation, and they were faintly advantageous to him, But Chen Chongsheng was not happy. He did not want anyone or anything other than himself to participate in this negotiation, whether it was the priests of the Li Palace, the teachers and students of the Orthodox Academy, Mount Li and Scholatry Manor, or his worried senior brother in the Dark Palace. And what did she mean by those words? Protector? Chen Chongsheng recalled the relevant records in the 7th book of the Taoist canon, the Covenant of Dawn, and then he recalled a few matters of the past that the Pope had seemingly inadvertently mentioned that night. Whether it was the orthodoxy or the Taoist faith of the past, if they wanted to preserve their Taoist orthodoxy that would never change for 10,000 generations, they would inevitably place great importance on their inheritances. The current Pope would often begin his plans many years in advance, educating and raising his disciples. Those young disciples possessed incredible talent in cultivation and astonishing potential, but if they wanted to grow into true experts capable of leading the Taoist sect forward, they still needed a very long time and many trials. Moreover, the number of orthodox disciples of the Taoist sect had always been very small. For example, in the previous generation, there was only the Pope and Shang Xingzhou. In this generation, there was only Yurand, Chen Chongsheng, and Shang Xingzhou, who had used some unknown method to confirm his identity, Mu Jiushi. With such a long and arduous journey of cultivation and such a small number of successors, logically speaking, the inheritance of the Tao sect could be cut off at any time. However, for countless years, Taoism had been passed down for countless generations, and such a situation had never occurred. Apart from the fact that those successors were as amazing as Yin and Shang, there was another very important reason. When these young successors traveled the world to cultivate, Taoism would often invite an extremely powerful or extremely influential senior to be that successor's guardian. The Taoist orthodoxy had existed for tens of thousands of years, and this rule had also been maintained for many generations, even longer than the Great Zhou dynasty. If Chen Chongsheng had lived in Xining Village's old temple as a legitimate disciple of the orthodoxy, then he truly should have had a guardian, and that guardian would assuredly be one of the few experts of the continent, most likely one of the storms of the 8 directions. But at the time, no one on the continent knew of his identity. Now that he was the Pope, did he still need a guardian? And why was it her? So the person Yin spoke of was you. Shang Xingzhou's expression was calm, not at all surprised. It was obvious that he had already known of this matter. He looked at the little black dragon and said, "After several hundred years, you can finally leave that old well of New North Bridge and regain your freedom. Why don't you return to the Southern Sea?" "Because this is my promise." The little black dragon stood in front of Chen Chongsheng and solemnly said. It was obvious that Shang Xingzhou had placed an enormous pressure on her. Her small face was filled with nervousness, but it was still determined. Shang Xingzhou suddenly asked, "Will you protect him?" She raised her face and proudly said, "Of course." Shang Xingzhou continued, "Are you willing to become one with him before the starry sky, to love him, to respect him, to comfort him, to love him as if he were yourself, to always place his name before your own in sickness and health, in wealth and poverty, in success and failure, all the way until you leave this world and return to the sea of stars?" These words were like a cool breeze, slowly arriving, but also like a clap of thunder, rumbling without end. This was one of the most ancient words in the scriptures of the Church. This was the oath of a guardian. This was a rule of the Li Palace. After a moment of silence, she said, "I am willing." Shang Xingzhou asked, "Even if you have to give up your life?" Without the slightest hesitation, she answered, "Yes." Several years ago at the bottom of New North Bridge, she had already given up something more important than her life for Chen Chongsheng, at least in her view. Of course, this did not mean that she was truly willing to die for Chen Chongsheng without any conditions, nor did it mean that she was not afraid of death. As members of the dragon race with their long lives, death was something they rarely considered, but it was precisely because their lives were so long that when they occasionally thought of it, they would feel a fear that far surpassed that of ordinary humans. She stared into Shang Xingzhou's eyes and said, "Not even Wang Jisi dared to kill me back then, only to imprison me. I don't believe that you would dare to kill me." In the common understanding of the cultivation world, the dragon race was often immortal. The main reason for this impression that went against the truth was that the dragon race was the highest level of life below the starry sky. They possessed an incomparably long lifespan and unimaginably powerful strength. Moreover, countless years ago, when the dragon race withdrew from the continent, they formed a pact with the other worlds. Any life form that offended the dragon race must die. The main reason that this pact had been passed down to this day was not because the demon race or the human race attached great importance to this promise, but because the dragon race was powerful. Whether it was the peak experts of the demon race or the human race, even if they were facing a lone or even weak dragon, they would rarely try to do anything. This was because every dragon had a soul pearl in its body. Once the dragon was killed, the soul pearl would shatter, and its clansmen in the distant south would sense it and carry out a frenzied vengeance. Not even the great Zhou dynasty ruled by Emperor Taizong was willing to pay this price. When the little black dragon wreaked havoc everywhere, Wang Jisi had used a scheme to capture her, but he had never killed her. Besides her being forgivable, an even more important reason was that she was not easy to kill and was not easy to kill. These two words of "not easy to kill" naturally had different meanings. For countless years, the dragon race had always been an object of reverence, far from the continent. But at certain moments in history, a few accidents would occasionally occur. Chapter 737. This so-called accident was because a few human or demon experts had appeared on the continent at the time. Those experts were far too powerful, so powerful that they were somewhat excessive. They even surprised the entire world and did not place the dragon race in their eyes at all. For example, the legendary grand scholar Tungus of the demon race was especially fond of using dragon blood to conduct research. In his long and dull life, countless dragons had died in that laboratory in Shulal City that could not see the sun but was always aimed at the moon. Some of the weaker black frost dragons would even drop out of the sky in fright upon hearing his name. Another example was the previous master of the mountain sea sword, who had once engaged in vicious battles with several evil dragons in the mountains and seas. It was said that the sea that had been dyed red later on produced particularly precious sea cucumbers. Another example was the strongest black frost dragon in the past 1,000 years that obtained the friendship of the demon lord in Shulal City was ultimately transformed by Zhou Dufu into that mountain range in the Garden of Zhou. Another example was that person called Suli. Back in the snowy hot springs, when the little black dragon first laid eyes on Suli, she had almost been scared to death. She could clearly sense that this person had once killed many dragons. Those who dared to slay dragons were not necessarily true warriors, because they could fail. Only those who succeeded in slaying dragons could be called powerful. Then, what did someone like Suli, who had made a special trip to the distant southern sea to ascertain just how powerful the dragon race was, and had slain countless dragons with a sword? Fine, he had always been an indescribable accident, an exception that bordered on madness. He could not be judged by common sense. The little black dragon did not know who Shang Xingzhou was, but she could sense that this powerful Taoist priest was also an accident, so she had purposely mentioned that matter of the past. In her view, even if the vicious reputation of the dragon race could not frighten him into retreating, the mention of a legendary name like Wang Jisi should at least make him feel deep veneration. Shang Xingzhou's response was very calm and indifferent, completely beyond her expectations. The rumors say that you have a very cruel personality, often eating people at the slightest disagreement. After you came ashore from the south, countless villages and cities were turned into ruins by you. He calmly looked at her, like an elder looking at a naughty child. He indifferently said, "But when I saw you in the frost flower shop, I knew that the rumors were not true." The frost flower shop was a very obscure place in the capital. Qin Chongxing knew it because Mo Yan's orange garden was there. Ordinary people would find it very difficult to remember. But how could the little black dragon forget? Hundreds of years ago, she was captured by the experts of the imperial court of the great Zhou dynasty. She lay powerlessly on the ground, gasping for breath. The surface of the bridge was covered with a thin layer of frost. That damned scholar, surnamed Wang, walked over from the other end of the bridge. The footprints he left behind were like blooming flowers. That was how the Frost Flower Shop got its name. Back then you saw me. The little black dragon looked at Shang Xingzhou, the unease and fear in her heart transforming into an intense wariness. Of course I've seen you before. The chains that Wang Jitsa used to bind you were borrowed from me. Shang Xingzhou looked down at her feet. Between her feet was a chain that looked a little short, but was actually very long. It formed a sharp contrast with the white snow. She stepped barefoot on the snow-covered grass as if she couldn't feel the cold, but when she heard Shang Xingzhou's words, she felt cold. Shang Xingzhou continued, "This chain is a treasure of the Li Palace. Junior brother was able to pull it out of the wall, but he couldn't break it." The little black dragon and Qin Chongxing silently glanced at each other. It was said that time was the most powerful and history the heaviest, and all this heaviest strength was contained in Shang Xingzhou's words. The elder of heavenly secrets had passed away. The Pope had returned to the Sea of Stars. The demon lord had fallen into the abyss, and Wang Jitsa had secluded himself from the world. There was no one left who had the right to speak to him about the past. From this perspective, history was time. It was just that in those past years, he had not written down his name. My companions and comrades have died one after another, and there's still one hiding in the mountains like a ghost. So I can no longer continue to hide. Shang Xingzhou looked at the two of them, feeling rather emotional, as if he was thinking of some story from long ago. He leisurely said, "Because we are both protectors." Qin Chongxing understood what he meant. No matter how much mutual deception and cruel schemes there were, no one could deny that at the very beginning, Emperor Taizong and the ministers of the Lingyan Pavilion were a group of complete idealists. They had thrown away their heads and spilled their blood in order to put an end to the chaos of the world, to expel the demons, and to become the protectors of the continent. Shang Xingzhou was not only a witness to that magnificent era, but also a person who had personally experienced it. He had always been one of these idealists. His reputation was not prominent, but he played an extremely important role. Emperor Taizu had allied with the current pope. Emperor Taizong had ultimately obtained the full support of the Li Palace in the coup of the 100-Her Garden, and those cruel stories related to the Lingyan Pavilion. Presumably, they all had something to do with him. Those comrades and companions of the past had either died, been killed by Emperor Taizong and him, or left. In short, after a long 1,000 years, he was the only one left. Even if he was the only one left, it was precisely because he was the only one left that he naturally had to shoulder the fates and responsibilities of his companions. He wanted to become the protector of the continent. He wanted to carry out Emperor Taizong's final decree. He wanted to realize the ideals of his companions. The human race would be unified, the demon race would bow their heads, and the world would be united for thousands of generations. No one can stop me, and no one should stop me, including you, Shang Xingzhou calmly and firmly said to Qin Chongxing. Qin Chongxing didn't know what to say. At this moment, the cry of a crane resounded through the night sky. A white crane had returned from the south and answered in his place. A gentle wind blew. It was very cold to ordinary people, but to the 2 people and 1 dragon beneath the great banyan tree, it could only be considered cool and refreshing. The snow on the lake rustled in the wind like withered leaves that had long ago been buried at the bottom of the snow. The starless night was not cold, nor was it dark, because no matter how the court changed, the lights of the 10,000 households of the capital would always illuminate the world. It had already been countless years. The white crane had brought with it a letter from Su Yorong, expressing Holy Maiden Peak's fearless stance. Madame Mu left in her dear carriage, expressing White Emperor City's stance. The stances of Mount Li and Scholatry Manor did not need to be asked. As for the most crucial orthodoxy, even if many people were willing to support Shang Xingzhou in front of the Pope's final decree, who would dare to openly oppose him? After a somewhat oppressive silence, Shang Xingzhou spoke once more. When I picked you up by the stream, I once said that your fate was very bad. He looked at Qin Chongqing and said, now it seems that I was wrong. The young Taoist from Xining village had now become the youngest pope in all of history. In his mother's womb, his sun will have been destroyed, so he should not have lived past 20. But now his meridians had been rebuilt, his star openings perfect, and his path of cultivation was smooth and level. He had the support of the entire orthodoxy, the support of many factions, and even a protector. Anyone could see that his fate was very good and worthy of praise. And then,